Hey there, tonight we're exploring how the Industrial Revolution transformed Christmas for ordinary families. Not the jolly, fairy tale Christmas you might imagine, but one brimming with the surprising shift from handmade to factory-made joys. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Once upon a time, before Santa's sleigh was turbocharged by the Industrial Revolution, Christmas was a much quieter affair. Picture a holiday season without the blaring jingle of cash registers or the blinding glow of festive lights. Yes, there was a Christmas once when the most extravagant thing in the living room was an actual tree. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what Christmas looked like back in the day, before steam engines and factory smoke carved their way into the holiday spirit. Let's rewind to the 18th century, a time when Christmas was more about modesty than magnificence. If your ancestors were among the ordinary folk, chances are they celebrated Christmas with handmade gifts and a meal that wouldn't look out of place on a regular Sunday. Forget iPads or even store-bought dolls. Back then, gifts were homemade, and often from the heart, or whatever part of the brain decided a hand-carved wooden toy was a good idea. And if you were really lucky, you might get a new pair of socks. Exciting stuff, right? Family gatherings were intimate, more out of necessity than choice. Travel was hardly a hop, skip, and jump affair. In most cases, if you couldn't walk there, you didn't go. Roads were more like dirt tracks, and winter wasn't exactly cooperative with travel plans, so family reunions often meant the people living right next door or a couple of fields away. Christmas was celebrated mostly at home, with local church services being the big social event, because what could be more festive than a cold stone building and some psalm hymns? The legendary Christmas feast, if you could call it that, was more of a potluck than a culinary competition. Goose was the favored bird, but it wasn't plucked from supermarket shelves. If you wanted one, someone had to raise it, and that someone might even be you. It was a communal effort to prepare the meal, and nothing went to waste. Puddings, perhaps the only thing that has retained its Christmas magic, were homemade and boiled for hours. No instant mix here, just flour, suet, and a whole lot of patience. The idea of a white Christmas was more of a grim reality than a romantic ideal. Central heating wasn't a thing, and if you wanted warmth, you either hugged the fireplace or bundled up in so many layers you resembled a walking quilt. Holiday decorations were sparse. A few evergreen branches here, some candles there. Fire hazards were apparently part of the seasonal charm. And forget about Christmas lights. Electricity was still centuries away from making its debut. Social customs had their own quirks. Mistletoe was more about pagan traditions than hallmark moments, and kissing under it was less about romance and more about a weird, lingering custom. Carols weren't background noise in a shopping mall. They were sung door to door, often for a bit of charity or just to spread cheer. And if you were caroling in the colder climates, it was more like an endurance test than a merry sing-along. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The vision of a harmonious, quaint Christmas is lovely, but not entirely accurate. Economic disparity was a stark reality. The wealthy had their grand feasts and multiple courses, while the poor often made do with the basics. The divide was as clear as a frosty winter's night. Christmas was still a time of goodwill, but the scales of generosity tilted heavily toward those who could afford it. The idea of Christmas as a season of giving was more aspirational than actual. So, why does any of this matter? Well, it sets the stage for the seismic shift that the Industrial Revolution would bring. As factories began to churn out mass-produced goods, the holiday transformed. Suddenly, Christmas became less about what you could make and more about what you could buy. But before we get to that shopping spree, let's linger a bit longer in this simpler time. A time when the holiday was focused on family, handmade presents, and good old-fashioned togetherness. Because soon, things would never be quite the same. And just like that, the stage was set for a holiday transformation as dramatic as Ebenezer Scrooge's overnight conversion. Enter the Industrial Revolution, the game-changer of the 19th century, a time when steam engines puffed new life into old customs and factories, became the new Santa's workshops. Let's dive into how this era spun Christmas on its head, turning it into the consumer-driven feast we recognize today. Before this industrial whirlwind, Christmas was a DIY affair. But when factories started cranking out goods like sausages in a butcher shop, suddenly everyone could have a slice of the Yuletide pie. Picture this. The year is 1843, Queen Victoria is on the throne, and London is engulfed in a fog of coal, smoke, and possibility. Factories hum with the sound of progress, and suddenly, toys are no longer just for the moneyed elite. Mass production made it possible for the average family to get their hands on a jack-in-the-box or a wooden train set. By the end of the century, the price of a simple toy could be as low as $1, making it affordable even for those who weren't rolling in dough. Talk about a Christmas miracle. While Santa's workshop was running full tilt, the print media was busy working its own kind of magic. Newspapers and magazines were the social media of the day, spreading the gospel of Christmas consumerism far and wide. You might think the image of Santa Claus, with his rotund belly and iconic red suit, has been around forever, but no, a little myth-busting here. Our modern Santa was largely the product of a marketing brainwave. In 1821, an anonymous poem titled "The Children's Friend" made the rounds, introducing a Santa-like figure. But it was Clement Clarke Moore's A Visit from St. Nicholas, published in 1823, that solidified the image of a jolly old elf delivering presents. Fast forward to the late 1800, and Santa was starring in ads for everything from toys to food. Coca-Cola would later give him an even more iconic makeover, but that's a story for another day. Speaking of marketing magic, first Christmas card was born in 1843, thanks to Sir Henry Cole, who frankly had better things to do than handwrite greetings to his entire social circle. He commissioned artist John Calcott Horsley to create the world's first commercial Christmas card, featuring a family raising a toast. It was a hit, and by the 1860s, sending cards was as much a Christmas tradition as stuffing yourself with mince pies. In fact, by 1880, more than 5 million Christmas cards were produced annually in the UK alone. Talk about a hallmark moment before Hallmark even existed. And then there's the story of Christmas decorations. Before the Industrial Revolution, holiday decor was limited to what you could scavenge from nature. But as factories churned out goods, decorations evolved from simple pine cones and berries to glass baubles and tinsel. By the late 1800, German factories were producing thousands of glass ornaments each year, transforming homes into winter wonderlands that would make any Instagram influencer jealous. The cost of a box of ornaments could be as low as a few pence, making it accessible to families eager to add sparkle to their celebrations. The economy, too, was doing its bit to fuel this festive frenzy. As industrialization marched on, real wages began to rise, albeit unevenly. Between 1850 and 1900, the average real wage in Britain increased by about 80%, according to economic historians. This newfound spending power meant people could afford a bit more than just the basics, and Christmas became an opportunity to flaunt this prosperity, at least for those lucky enough to be on the right side of the economic tracks. But let's not get too carried away with the jingling bells and twinkling lights. The Industrial Revolution also highlighted the stark contrast between the haves and the have-nots. While some families were filling their parlors with the latest toys and decorations, others still struggled to make ends meet. The factories that produced these Christmas wonders were often staffed by workers toiling in harsh conditions for long hours and low pay. For many, the Christmas season meant extra shifts rather than extra cheer. So, what's the takeaway here? The Industrial Revolution didn't just stuff stockings with mass-produced goodies. It also transformed the very essence of Christmas. It took a holiday rooted in handmade traditions and rebranded it with a slick sheen of consumerism. But let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't all just about the merchandise. This era also played a crucial role in cementing Christmas as a time for family, festivity, and yes, a bit of retail therapy. And while the holiday spirit was often overshadowed by the clatter of cash registers, the dream of a Merry Christmas was now within reach for more people than ever before. As we wrap up this chapter, keep in mind that the story of Christmas is far from over. The Industrial Revolution laid the groundwork, but as we'll see, the 20th century had its own ideas about how to deck the halls. Stay tuned, because the evolution of Christmas is a gift that keeps on giving, and there's plenty more to unwrap. As the dust settled on this industrial upheaval, Christmas found itself caught in a tug-of-war between tradition and transformation. The world was changing faster than you could say, ho, 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 and nowhere was this more evident than in the bustling cities, where the rhythm of factory work set the pace of life. Urbanization was in full swing, with folks leaving their rural roots behind in search of greener, albeit smokier, pastures. By the mid-19th century, cities like Manchester and Birmingham were swelling with new arrivals, their populations doubling in size every few decades. People were packed tighter than a tin of sardines, living in cramped quarters that made holiday gatherings more about bumping elbows than spreading cheer. With this migration came a seismic shift in the way families celebrated Christmas. Back in the countryside, you could count on a slower pace of life, where the holidays stretched out like a lazy cat in the sun. But in the city, time was a luxury few could afford. Factory bells told not just the start of a workday, but often the end of holiday leisure. For the working class, Christmas wasn't a pause button. It was more like a brief commercial break in the relentless broadcast of industrial labor. Imagine working 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and then trying to muster the energy to deck the halls. Spoiler alert, it wasn't happening. This frenetic pace didn't just shorten the holiday season, it reshaped it. Families had to get creative, squeezing celebrations into small windows of opportunity. Ever wonder why Christmas dinner became such a big deal? Partly because it was one of the few times everyone could gather around the table, however meager the spread. In a twist of irony, the Industrial Revolution that brought mass-produced goods also meant meals were often a celebration of canned or preserved items. Convenient, yes, but hardly gourmet. And yet, amidst the clatter of machines and the haze of coal dust, these moments of togetherness were cherished, brief flickers of warmth in a harsh, cold reality. But let's not get too misty-eyed. The truth is, this era was a Dickensian drama come to life. The wealth disparity was as glaring as a Christmas tree on steroids. While the upper crust toasted to prosperity with imported wines and extravagant feasts, the working class often faced a holiday season as bleak as a British winter. In 1840s London, for instance, the average annual income for a factory worker was a paltry £20, barely enough to keep a family fed and clothed, let alone indulging in holiday excess. Meanwhile, the bourgeoisie could drop that amount on a single lavish Christmas party without batting an eye. So, how did this wealth gap shape Christmas celebrations? Well, it was a tale of two holidays. For the affluent, the season was an opportunity to flaunt their wealth and social standing. These were the folks who could afford to turn their homes into veritable winter wonderlands, complete with imported German ornaments and glittering baubles. Their Christmas trees, inspired by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's own festive fur, were symbols of status as much as seasonal cheer. It was a case of keeping up with the Joneses, Victorian style. Conversely, the working class had to make do with what little they had. Their Christmas trees, if they could manage one, were often decorated with handmade ornaments, scraps of paper, bits of string, and whatever else could be spared from the household budget. Handmade gifts still held sway, not out of choice, but necessity. For many, a homemade scarf or knitted socks were not just presents. They were acts of love woven into every stitch. Talk about putting the present in presents. And yet, even amidst these challenges, the spirit of Christmas managed to shine through the soot and hardship. If anything, the stark realities of urban life deepened the holiday's meaning for those on the fringes. It wasn't about the gifts under the tree, but the people around it. Acts of charity and community took center stage, as those with a few spare pennies would often give to those with none. The idea of Christmas as a time of goodwill and generosity wasn't just a marketing ploy. It was a lifeline for many. Now, let's debunk another myth, the notion that Christmas was a universally joyous occasion. The truth is, for the working class, the holiday season could be a time of acute stress. While the wealthy indulged in leisurely pursuits, the poor often faced increased pressure to provide a semblance of normalcy for their families. It was a delicate balancing act between stretching a meager budget and maintaining holiday traditions. The festive season could be as much a reminder of what they lacked as what they cherished. The economic strains also meant that many children, instead of enjoying a holiday break, were thrust into the workforce to help make ends meet. Child labor was rampant, with little ones as young as 6 employed in factories and mines. Their Christmas wish lists were less about toys and more about essentials, like the hope of a warm meal or a day off. And while Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol painted a picture of redemption and transformation, for many families, the reality was more Scrooge than Tiny Tim. The holidays couldn't magically erase the daily grind. They could only offer a momentary escape. So, as we wrap up this part of our Yuletide journey, let's remember that the Industrial Revolution was a double-edged sword. It brought the gift of mass production and consumer culture, but also highlighted the deep divides between rich and poor. Christmas became a litmus test of this disparity, a season of light that cast long shadows. But even in the darkest corners, the human spirit found ways to shine. Whether through charity, community, or sheer resilience, the holiday managed to be a beacon of hope, proving that while money can buy ornaments and gifts, it can't buy the true essence of Christmas. Stay tuned, because our tale of holiday evolution is far from over, and there's plenty more history to unwrap in the chapters ahead. So, as we peel back the layers on this Victorian Yuletide, it's time to confront the elephant in the room, or rather the ghost. Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Now, Charles Dickens might have been the literary Santa of the season, delivering stories as rich as plum pudding, but let's not get too misty-eyed. A Christmas Carol is like the pumpkin spice latte of Christmas tales, ubiquitous, cozy, and a tad oversweetened. Dickens did weave a tale that tugged at the heartstrings, turning Ebenezer Scrooge into the poster child for holiday redemption. But was the Victorian Christmas truly a season awash with philanthropy and goodwill? Or was it more of an idealized vision, a fictional sleigh ride through the snow-covered streets of London? First, let's talk numbers. In the mid-1800s, when Dickens was penning his festive fable, London's population was skyrocketing, surging from 3 million in 1851 to 2 million by 1871. It was a city of stark contrasts, where opulent mansions rubbed shoulders with overcrowded slums. Dickens was writing at a time when about 30% of Londoners lived below the poverty line, according to historians. That's a lot of Cratchit families struggling to put a goose on the table. The reality was that many of those festive dinners were more bar, humbug, than God bless us, everyone. While the affluent might have indulged in roasted meats and imported wines, the working class often faced a feast that was more bread than bird. Records suggest that a typical labourer in 1840 London earned around 15 shillings a week, barely enough to scrape by after rent and coal. Forget turkey with all the trimmings. A humble joint of beef was a luxury. And speaking of luxury, let's not forget the chimney sweeps, those pint-sized labourers who could teach Santa a thing or two about shimmying down a flue. Many of these poor souls were children, some as young as 5, earning a pittance while risking life and limb. Their Christmas wishes weren't for toys or treats, but for a day off or a heart meal. The reality was that charity often took a backseat to survival, and goodwill was a currency not everyone could afford. But here's the thing. Dickens' story wasn't just a slice of Victorian life, it was a call to action. A Christmas Carol didn't merely reflect the spirit of the times, it helped shape it. Dickens, the master storyteller, wasn't just spinning a yarn, he was holding up a mirror to society and saying, "We can do better." And while Scrooge's transformation might have been fiction, it struck a chord that resonated far beyond the page. Yet, let's not kid ourselves. The Victorian Christmas was as much about appearances as altruism. For the well-heeled, acts of charity were often a way to flaunt their benevolence, because nothing says Christmas spirit like a good PR move. Philanthropy was often a social event, with charity balls and galas offering the wealthy a chance to rub elbows while raising funds. It was virtue signalling with a side of eggnog. But if Dickens painted the era in rosy hues, it wasn't entirely without cause. The 19th century did see a surge in charitable organizations, with groups like the Salvation Army, founded in 1865, stepping up to the plate. These organizations played a crucial role in providing for the less fortunate, offering everything from food and clothing to shelter and education. By the 1880, the Salvation Army alone was serving over 3 million meals annually. It's heartwarming stuff, but let's not confuse it with universal utopia. So, where does this leave us? Well, the myth of the Victorian Christmas as a time of unbridled charity and goodwill is just that, a myth, albeit a charming one. The reality was a mixed bag of generosity and self-interest, with a dash of Dickensian drama thrown in for good measure. The truth is, while the season did inspire acts of kindness, it also highlighted economic divides as glaring as a string of mismatched Christmas lights. In a way, Dickens' story was both a reflection and a revolution, a reminder that even in times of hardship, the human spirit could muster a little magic. It was a call to arms, a reminder that Christmas wasn't just about feasting and festivities, but about compassion and community. And while the Victorian era might not have lived up to its own myth, it laid the groundwork for the idea that the holiday season could be a time of transformation, a chance for Scrooges everywhere to find their inner Cratchit. As we close this chapter, remember that the story of Christmas is still being written. The Victorian era may have put the tinsel on the tree, but there's plenty more history to unwrap as we continue our festive journey. So stick around, because the tale of Christmas isn't done spinning its magic just yet. And that, my friends, brings us to a pivotal question. What did the Industrial Revolution really leave under the Christmas tree? Let's dive into the aftermath of this seismic societal shift and unwrap the legacy it bequeathed to our modern festivities. Spoiler alert, it's not all elves and eggnog. First, let's get one thing straight. The Industrial Revolution was the ultimate Christmas makeover artist. It took a quaint, homespun holiday and draped it in a cloak of mass production and consumerism. Before you could say, Merry Christmas, the whole affair went from intimate gatherings to bustling bazaars. By the time we hit the 20th century, Christmas had transformed into a commercial juggernaut powered by the relentless engine of capitalism. But how did this happen, exactly? Well, for starters, the Industrial Revolution democratized access to goods in a way that was previously unimaginable. Thanks to advancements in manufacturing and transportation, steam engines and railways, products once reserved for the upper crust became available to the masses. By the late 19th century, even a factory worker could afford a few store-bought baubles to hang on their tree, a far cry from the days when decorations were limited to whatever nature offered. And speaking of trees, let's not forget the rise of the Christmas tree itself as a symbol of this new consumer culture. Once a Germanic oddity, the Christmas tree became all the rage in Britain and beyond, thanks in no small part to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. By the late 1800, entire industries were dedicated to producing ornaments and tinsel, with German factories leading the charge. It was all about outshining your neighbor's tree with the latest and greatest sparkle. But it wasn't just about the shiny stuff. The Industrial Revolution also changed how we think about Christmas giving. Enter the gift economy. Before this industrial upheaval, gifts were practical, often handmade items. A pair of knitted mittens, a jar of homemade jam, that was your Christmas haul. But as mass production took hold, gifts became more about indulgence than necessity. Suddenly, the act of giving was less about the item's utility and more about its ability to impress. This gift-giving shift was fueled by none other than the burgeoning advertising industry, the true unsung hero of the modern Christmas. As early as the 1840, newspapers and magazines were filled with ads touting the latest must-have toys and treats. By the turn of the century, retailers had honed the art of the Christmas campaign, turning the holiday into a retail bonanza that would make even Santa jealous. The message was clear. The more you spent, the merrier your Christmas. But here's the kicker. This commercialization wasn't just about selling stuff. It was about selling a lifestyle. The Industrial Revolution helped create the aspirational Christmas, one where families strive to recreate the idyllic scenes splashed across holiday cards and advertisements. It was a vision of festive abundance, complete with merry gatherings, extravagant feasts, and a mountain of gifts. It was a dream as glossy as the wrapping paper it was packaged in. Yet, as with all dreams, reality had a way of creeping in. The truth was, not everyone could afford the Christmas of their dreams. The Industrial Revolution may have raised living standards for some, but it also entrenched economic inequalities. While many families could now afford a few luxuries, others remained on the outside looking in, their holiday cheer tempered by financial strain. The pressure to keep up with the Joneses was real, and for some, it turned the season of goodwill into a season of stress. And that brings us to the crux of the matter. The Industrial Revolution, for all its gifts, left us with a Christmas that's as much about consumption as celebration. It turned a holiday rooted in simplicity and togetherness into a bustling, commercialized affair. But let's be honest, the romance of a simpler Christmas still holds a certain charm. There's a nostalgia for the days when the holiday was less about what you bought and more about who you spent it with. So, what's the moral of this Yuletide tale? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, much like the holiday itself. The Industrial Revolution gave us the modern Christmas, complete with all its trappings and traditions. It brought us the bustling shopping malls, the dazzling lights, and the gift-giving extravaganzas that define the season today. But it also left us with a holiday that, for better or worse, measures its success in dollars and cents. Yet, amidst the hustle and bustle, the true spirit of Christmas still flickers, like a candle in the winter's chill. It's in the acts of kindness and generosity, in the gatherings of family and friends, and in the shared moments of joy and reflection. It's a reminder that while the Industrial Revolution may have changed the way we celebrate, it didn't change the essence of what Christmas is all about. In the end, the story of Christmas is a testament to the resilience of tradition in the face of change, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find meaning and magic in even the most commercial of holidays. So, as you deck the halls and wrap your presents, remember that the holiday's true gift isn't found under the tree, but in the hearts of those who gather around it. And that, my friends, is a legacy worth celebrating. You're standing on the edge of the Mongolian steppes, a place so vast and unyielding it seems to stretch beyond the horizon, defying any sense of scale you might cling to. This isn't your typical grassy meadow. This is a sprawling expanse that whispers tales of survival and resilience. Welcome to the playground of the Mongol warriors, where Mother Nature plays hardball and only the toughest stick around to tell the tale. Let's talk geography, because without understanding the lay of the land, you can't fully appreciate the grit it took to thrive here. The steppes cover over 887,000 square miles, a mind-blowing stretch that's larger than modern-day Mexico. We're talking about a land where the summers sizzle up to 104 degrees F, 40 degrees C, and winters freeze you with temperatures plummeting to minus 40 degrees F, minus 40 degrees C. Yes, you read that right. It's so cold they didn't even bother giving it a different number in Celsius. These extremes aren't just unpleasant, they're downright brutal. Ever try to imagine life without a thermostat? This is it. Here, the land is flat as a pancake, marked by a few rolling hills and sparse vegetation. Trees. They're a rare sight, and when you do spot one, it's like meeting an old friend in an unexpected place. The grasslands dominate, offering a kind of natural buffet for the ultimate survival tool in the Mongol arsenal, the horse. Ah, the Mongol horse. These aren't your average equestrian show ponies. These little beasts are more reliable than your favorite smartphone, and they won't run out of battery. Short, starky, and hardier than a bowl of stone soup, Mongol horses are the unsung heroes of the steppes. They're not winning beauty contests, but boy, can they endure. Not much taller than 5 feet at the shoulder, these horses can cover up to 100 miles in a day, leaving most other cavalry units of the time eating dust. That's like riding from New York to Philadelphia and back again, without a single gas station pit stop. This brings us to the ingenious mobility of the Mongol warriors. Picture this. You're part of a cavalry that can move so fast. Your enemies are still processing yesterday's news while you're already at their gates. This kind of speed was a revelation in a world where marching armies trudged along at a snail's pace. The Mongol warriors didn't just ride. They practically lived on their horses, covering ground with the kind of efficiency that would make a modern-day logistics manager weep with envy. Now, for the romanticized notion that the Mongols were born in the saddle, let's pump the brakes a bit. Yes, they were exceptional riders, but this was a skill honed from necessity, not some mystical birthright. When your survival depends on your ability to chase down your dinner or avoid becoming someone else's, you learn to ride, and you learn fast. The Mongols didn't just adapt to the steppes, they dominated them, turning the harsh environment into a strategic advantage. But life wasn't all about galloping across the plains like a scene from an epic movie. The reality was a constant battle against the elements. Harsh winds could whip across the steppes at 60 mph, turning a simple walk into a battle for balance. The land offered few resources, forcing these warriors to become masters of improvisation. Water, you'd better remember where that last stream was, because it might be miles before you find another. Food, hope you're good at hunting, because the local grocery store is a few centuries away. Yet, despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the Mongol warriors flourished. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. It was this ability to adapt and persevere that laid the foundation for the Mongol Empire, a powerhouse that would eventually stretch from Eastern Europe to the Sea of Japan. This was no fluke of history. It was a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of a people who had learned to turn the unforgiving steppes into their greatest ally. So here you are, standing amidst this vast, demanding landscape, trying to wrap your head round how these warriors turned such relentless conditions into a launching pad for one of history's most formidable empires. It's a story of grit, guts, and horses that would make even the most seasoned adventurers tip their hats in respect. As the sun sets on the steppes, casting its golden glow over the endless grasslands, you can almost feel the echoes of hoofbeats and the whispers of a bygone era swirling around you. This was the Mongolian steppes, a place where only the strong survived and the strongest thrived. And speaking of thriving against all odds, let's dive into the intricate web of Mongol society, a tapestry woven with strands of loyalty, merit, and a sprinkle of ruthless pragmatism. If you thought the steppes were wild, wait till you hear about the social and political structure that allowed the Mongols to not just survive, but to stamp all over the concept of impossible. The heart of Mongol society was the clan, the fundamental building block of their world. Imagine a sprawling family reunion that never quite ends, where everyone knows their place and their role. Clan loyalty was no joke. It was as binding as a modern-day contract, only without the fine print. Betray your clan, and you'd better hope the steppes swallow you whole before they do. This loyalty wasn't some quaint notion of kinship. It was a survival tactic. The steppes, after all, didn't exactly offer a safety net. When the going got tough, having a tight-knit group to fall back on was the difference between life and death. Now, let's get one thing straight. The Mongols weren't just a bunch of horse-riding nomads with a penchant for conquest. They had a social system that was as complex as it was efficient. At the top were the Khans, leaders whose authority was based less on birthright and more on their ability to lead, strategize, and inspire. It's like the ultimate meritocracy, where your promotion depended on how well you could steer a horse and a horde in the right direction. If you could prove your mettle in battle or politics, you could rise through the ranks, regardless of your lineage. This system tapped into an almost Darwinian sense of survival. Only the most capable led, which meant that the leadership was always sharp, always ready. And then there's Temujin, the man who would become known to the world as Genghis Khan. In 1206, he did what no one else had managed before. He united the fractious tribes of the Mongolian steppes. This wasn't just a feat of military genius. It was a political coup d'etat wrapped in a cunning display of diplomacy. Genghis Khan understood that to forge an empire, he had to first forge a sense of unity among people who were as stubborn as the land they rode on. It was less about creating a new nation and more about getting everyone to play nice on the same team. A bit like herding cats, if those cats had swords and a deeply ingrained sense of independence. The unification was a masterclass in coalition building. Genghis Khan didn't just bully his way to the top, though he certainly wasn't above a bit of strategic intimidation. He created alliances through marriages and shared spoils, ensuring that everyone had a stake in the new order. He knew that loyalty was best bred through mutual benefit, not fear alone. By integrating the various tribes into his grand vision, he essentially gave them a reason to fight for something greater than their next meal. This was more than just a military alliance. It was the birth of a new sense of identity. Under his banner, the tribes were no longer just surviving. They were thriving together. You might think that such a meritocratic system would lead to endless backstabbing and power plays. And sure, there was plenty of intrigue, but the stakes were too high for petty squabbles to derail the whole operation. The Mongols were pragmatic to a fault. They understood that a divided house was a vulnerable one, especially when your house is the endless expanse of the steppes. So they focused on what worked, rewarding talent, fostering loyalty, and keeping their eyes on the prize. In this crucible of necessity and innovation, Mongol leaders developed an almost uncanny knack for governance. They blended strict military discipline with surprisingly modern administrative practices. Think of it as ancient bureaucracy meets warrior ethos. They instituted a system of laws, the yasa, which among other things codified their values and ensured order within the ranks. This wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about laying the groundwork for an empire that would eventually stretch across continents. Genghis Khan's genius lay in his ability to balance the carrot and the stick. He was as adept at rewarding loyalty as he was at punishing betrayal. The Mongol code was one of fairness, but also one of uncompromising justice. It was a system that got results, swiftly and efficiently. And it was this combination of merit, loyalty, and a clear-eyed view of human nature that allowed the Mongols to build an empire on the backbone of the steppes. So here we are, looking at a society that turned the harshest of environments into a breeding ground for one of history's most formidable forces. The political and social structure of the Mongols wasn't just an accident of history. It was a calculated evolution. An evolution that took the raw, untamed energy of the steppes and channeled it into a force that would shake the world. And as we delve deeper into this story, remember, the Mongols weren't just a force of nature. They were a force of human ingenuity and ambition. They took the cards they were dealt and played them with a skill that left their contemporaries in awe. This was no fluke. It was a testament to the power of unity, the allure of opportunity, and the relentless drive to conquer the unconquerable. And as we delve deeper into this story, remember, the Mongols weren't just a force of nature. They were a force of human ingenuity and ambition. They took the cards they were dealt and played them with a skill that left their contemporaries in awe. This was no fluke. It was a testament to the power of unity, the allure of opportunity, and the relentless drive to conquer the unconquerable. Now, let's switch gears from the sweeping landscape and political theatrics to the nitty-gritty of Mongol warfare, the logistics of how they turned their empire-building endeavors into a historical highlight reel. You might think warfare was all about brute force and swinging swords, but the Mongols played a cerebral game of chess on horseback. They had a knack for tactics that would make any modern military strategist nod in admiration, or perhaps envy. Take the feigned retreat. For instance, this wasn't just some clever trick. It was a masterstroke of battlefield deception. Imagine your enemy thinking they've got you on the ropes, only for you to pull a fast one and turn the tables. The Mongols used this tactic like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Only the rabbit was a horde of warriors charging at you when you least expected it. They would pretend to flee, dragging their pursuers into a trap where the real Mongol forces waited, ready to pounce. Talk about turning a tactical retreat into a strategic masterpiece. But this wasn't their only ace in the hole. The Mongols understood the art of adaptability like no other. Where others saw obstacles, they saw opportunities. Their ability to adapt to different terrains and climates was like a survivalist's dream. From the scorching deserts of Persia to the frigid Siberian forests, they made each landscape their own. This wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about mental flexibility. Their speed on horseback was legendary, allowing them to move armies over vast distances faster than news of their approach could spread. In an era where information traveled at a glacial pace, their lightning-fast mobility was a game-changer. Now, let's hit pause on the glamour of their tactical prowess and talk about the less romantic but equally vital side of warfare, economics. Because, as any seasoned general will tell you, you can't wage war on empty pockets. The Mongols didn't just conquer territories. They had a knack for squeezing every drop of economic benefit from their conquests. Plunder wasn't just a side perk. It was an integral part of their wartime strategy. Gold, silver, silk, you name it, they took it. If it wasn't nailed down, it was fair game. And if it was nailed down, well, they'd probably take the nails too. But the Mongols were more than just looters. They understood the power of tribute and the art of taxation. Once a region was under Mongol control, they ensured it paid its dues. Tribute was like a membership fee for the Mongol Empire's protection plan. In exchange for not turning your city into the backdrop for a disaster movie, you handed over a hefty chunk of your wealth. It was a win-win. Well, mostly for the Mongols. This economic strategy didn't just fill their coffers. It stabilized their empire by creating a steady flow of resources. Now, let's pull back the curtain on the romantic image of the noble warrior that history often paints. The truth is, the reality of conquest was far grimmer than the tales of valor and honor. The Mongols were efficient and ruthless. and their campaigns left a trail of devastation. Remember, they weren't asking for Yelp reviews after sacking a city. The romanticized warrior ethos often glosses over the fact that conquest is a dirty business, full of blood, sweat, and a fair bit of terror. Yet, it's precisely this blend of romantic allure and harsh reality that makes the Mongol story so compelling. They were not just warriors, but masterful strategists who leveraged every advantage, geographical, tactical, and economic, to build an empire that stretched from the Sea of Japan to the plains of Hungary. It's easy to get swept up in the myths of gallant horsemen and epic battles, but behind the romance lies the stark truth of human ambition and the often brutal path it carves through history. So, as we continue to unravel the Mongol tapestry, remember that it's woven with both the shimmering threads of legend and the darker strands of reality. The Mongols weren't just riding into the sunset. They were reshaping the world with each hoofbeat. And as we explore further, you'll see how their story is not just about conquest, but about the relentless pursuit of power and the complex web of factors that made it all possible. Stay tuned, because the journey through Mongol history is far from over, and the next chapter promises even more twists and turns. Now, let's dive into the Mongol Empire's less glamorous, yet profoundly influential contributions, economic innovations, and cultural exchanges. You might think a society often painted as the poster child for barbarism would have little interest in anything beyond conquest and plunder. But hold on to your hats, because the Mongols were about to flip the script on that stereotype. First up, let's talk about paper currency. Yes, you heard that right. Long before you could lose your paycheck to a latte habit, the Mongols were advocating for paper over metal. Under Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire adopted and expanded the use of paper money, a concept they borrowed from the Chinese Song dynasty. They didn't just dabble in it, they went all in. By the late 13th century, they were cranking out paper bills faster than you can say economic revolution. Now, here's the kicker. This wasn't just an administrative curiosity. It was an economic game changer. Think about it. No more lugging around sacks of coins like a medieval Scrooge McDuck. This light-as-a-feather currency facilitated trade across the vast Mongol Empire, which stretched from Hungary to the Sea of Japan. It was like someone hit fast forward on commerce, making transactions quicker, safer, and let's be honest, a lot less back-breaking. Still, the introduction of paper money wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Imagine explaining to a skeptical merchant that this flimsy piece of paper was worth his weight in gold. It took a bit of persuasion, and sometimes a little coercion, to gain widespread acceptance. But the Mongols were nothing if not persistent. They knew that for their empire to thrive, they needed a robust economic backbone, and they weren't afraid to innovate. And while we're on the subject of connectivity, let's chat about the Mongol postal relay system, the yam. Forget your snail-paced medieval pigeons. This was the FedEx of the 13th century. The yam was a network of relay stations dotted across the empire, like a string of pearls on a map. Riders could swap horses at these stations, ensuring that messages traveled at breakneck speeds. In a world where news usually moved slower than a snail on a caffeine crash, this system was revolutionary. You might assume that such a sophisticated network was the brainchild of a society obsessed with efficiency. And you'd be right. But it was more than that. It was a symbol of the Mongols' understanding of the importance of communication. They knew that an empire as vast as theirs couldn't run on brute force alone. It needed information, and more importantly, the rapid dissemination of it. The yam allowed the Mongol rulers to keep their fingers on the pulse of their empire, reacting swiftly to threats and opportunities alike. Here's where we get to the irony of it all. This so-called barbaric society, often portrayed as a horde of marauding horsemen, was responsible for one of the most sophisticated communication networks of its time. It's like discovering that your gruff, no-nonsense neighbor is also a tech savant with a penchant for developing cutting-edge apps. But it wasn't just about speed and efficiency. The yam also played a critical role in the cultural exchanges that flourished under Mongol rule. It connected people, ideas, and goods across continents, fostering a level of cultural intermingling that was unprecedented. Imagine the Silk Road on steroids, with art, science, and philosophy flowing freely between East and West. The Mongol Empire was a melting pot, and the yam was the spoon stirring the pot. And let's not forget about the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. From the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, this era of relative stability allowed trade and cultural exchanges to flourish. It was like the Mongols had hit the pause button on their usual warrior antics to focus on building a global community. The Silk Road became a bustling artery of commerce and culture, with merchants, scholars, and travelers moving freely across the empire. This period saw the spread of technological advancements like gunpowder, printing, and astronomy from east to west. Think of it as the Mongol version of a tech boom, with ideas crossing borders faster than you can say intellectual property. The result was a vibrant exchange that enriched societies far beyond the Mongols' immediate reach. Now, let's take a step back and appreciate the irony wrapped in this narrative. The Mongols, often vilified as destroyers, were in many ways builders of a new world order. Their conquests laid the groundwork for a level of global interaction that was previously unimaginable. It's a testament to the complexity of history, where the lines between villain and visionary blur into a tapestry of contradictions. But before you start picturing the Mongols as some benevolent force for global unity, let's not gloss over the darker realities. Their expansionist policies were brutal, and the path to this interconnected world was paved with blood and destruction. It's a reminder that progress often comes at a hefty price, and history is rarely as black and white as we'd like it to be. As we leave behind the romanticized image of the Mongols galloping into the sunset, remember that their legacy is a mixed bag of innovation and upheaval. They were both warriors and world changers, leaving an indelible mark on the pages of history. And while their story is far from over, it's a vivid reminder that even the most feared conquerors can be unlikely harbingers of progress. Stay tuned, because this roller coaster ride through Mongol history is about to take some unexpected twists. As we delve deeper into their legacy, we'll uncover more tales of intrigue, innovation, and the relentless human drive to reshape the world, one hoofbeat at a time. But as with all great rides, the Mongol Empire's roller coaster had to come back down to earth eventually. What goes up must come down, and for the Mongols, this descent wasn't some gentle glide. It was more of a freefall into chaos, division, and a hearty dose of overextension. You might think an empire that spanned 12 million square miles at its peak could handle a little growth spurt, but the reality was more akin to a teenager who'd outgrown their shoes overnight. The Mongols had expanded so rapidly that their empire became a logistical nightmare, with parts of it feeling more like distant relatives than a cohesive family unit. Internal divisions, the kryptonite of empires everywhere. The Mongol Empire, once united under the iron fist of Genghis Khan, started to crack at the seams as familial loyalty gave way to personal ambition. Picture it. You've got Genghis Khan's descendants squabbling like kids fighting over the last slice of pizza. The empire was divided into khanates, chunks of territory that were supposed to be ruled in harmony. Spoiler alert, they weren't. The Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty each had their own agendas, and let's just say cooperation wasn't on the menu. Now, here's where things get juicy. The Mongol leaders were so consumed with their own power plays that they forgot the first rule of empire maintenance: keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Instead, they were too busy stabbing each other in the back to notice the wolves at their door. The internal power struggles weakened their defenses, turning the once mighty empire into a sitting duck for external threats. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. Then there's the little matter of overextension. Remember how the Mongols stretched from Eastern Europe to the Sea of Japan? Yeah, turns out that's not exactly sustainable. Managing an empire that vast is like trying to juggle flaming swords while riding a unicycle. Impressive, sure, but eventually you're going to get burned. Communication was slow, resources were stretched thin, and maintaining control over such diverse cultures and terrains became a Herculean task. The Mongols had bitten off more than they could chew, and the resulting indigestion was a bitter pill to swallow. Adaptation, failures also played a starring role in the Mongol decline. While they had mastered the art of conquest, they struggled with the whole ruling part. The Mongols were exceptional warriors, but less stellar at the administrative nitty-gritty required to keep an empire running smoothly. They failed to adapt their nomadic, martial culture to the sedentary, and bureaucratic demands of their newly conquered territories. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and surprise, surprise, it didn't fit. Despite their attempts to assimilate and adopt local customs, they couldn't quite shake off their warrior roots. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, tried his hand at ruling China, establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271. He embraced Chinese customs, but his efforts to blend Mongol and Chinese governance were met with mixed results. The Mongols were seen as foreign rulers, outsiders in their own empire, and this disconnect sowed the seeds of their eventual downfall in China. So, what does this all mean? Well, empires are fickle beasts, and the Mongol Empire was no exception. Its decline was a cocktail of internal strife, overexpansion, and a failure to adapt, a potent blend that would bring even the most formidable of empires to its knees. But before you start writing off the Mongols as just another footnote in history, let's talk about their legacy, because, oh boy, is it a doozy. While the Mongols may have exited the stage with a less than graceful bow, their impact continued to reverberate through the annals of history. They were the ultimate cultural brokers, bridging east and west in ways that still resonate today. The Mongol Empire facilitated unprecedented cultural exchanges, spreading technologies, ideas, and even cuisines across continents. The Silk Road became a superhighway of innovation, with everything from gunpowder to noodles making their way from Asia to Europe. And let's not forget the myths. The Mongols have been both vilified and romanticized in equal measure, with tales of their exploits capturing the imagination of generations. Genghis Khan, in particular, is a figure shrouded in legend, a ruthless conqueror to some, a unifier and visionary to others. His legacy is a testament to the duality of human nature, where ambition and brutality coexist with innovation and progress. In the end, the Mongol story is a rich tapestry of contradictions, a reminder that history is never as simple as black and white. They were warriors and diplomats, destroyers and builders, feared conquerors, and unlikely harbingers of cultural exchange. Their empire may have crumbled, but their influence endures, a testament to the complexity of history and the enduring power of human ambition. So, as you drift off to sleep, cradled by the echoes of hoofbeats and the whispers of a bygone era, remember the Mongols. They were a force of nature, a whirlwind of change that swept across the world, leaving a legacy of both destruction and enlightenment. Theirs is a story of grit, guts, and a relentless drive to conquer the unconquerable, a tale that continues to captivate, inspire, and remind us of the indomitable spirit of humanity. Sweet dreams, my fellow history buffs. May your dreams be as epic as the Mongol Empire itself. Your eyes blink open to the dim light filtering through the wooden walls of a Viking longhouse. You sit up on your straw-filled mattress, which, let's be honest, is more hay bale with delusions of grandeur than a modern Sealy. Welcome to 10th century Scandinavia, where the concept of personal space is as mythical as Thor's hammer. As you stretch out the kinks, you can't ignore the aroma of the great outdoors, mixed liberally with the unmistakable scent of fellow humans who haven't discovered deodorant. Now, let's talk architecture, because these Viking longhouses are the unsung heroes of medieval Scandinavian life. Measuring in at an impressive 5 to 7 meters wide and stretching up to a whopping 75 meters in length, they're basically the medieval equivalent of a sports hall. Vikings weren't just raiders and traders. They were architectural savvy, crafting these wooden wonders to withstand some of the harshest climates on Earth. Built from oak, ash, or pine, these homes were designed to shelter not just the family, but also livestock. Yes, cows were your roommates, and no, they didn't help with the rent. The longhouse's structure was a masterpiece of practicality over comfort. Thick wooden beams held up the roof, which was often thatched with sod or reeds, materials that provided excellent insulation against the Scandinavian chill. The walls were made from vertical planks, or wattle and daub, a technique that sounds like a pub game, but actually involves a mixture of woven sticks and mud. This wasn't just for aesthetics. It was a matter of survival in an area where winter lasted about as long as your last New Year's resolution. But before you get too misty-eyed about the romance of communal living, let's debunk a few myths. Sure, the idea of family bonding sounds heartwarming, but in reality, these living arrangements were a cacophony of snoring, grumbling, and the occasional argument over who ate the last slice of dried fish. Privacy. Forget it. The Longhouse was essentially one giant room, divided into separate areas by wooden partitions or curtains, which did little to muffle the sound of your neighbor's nighttime symphony of snores. And then there's the smoke. Vikings kept fires burning in long hearths down the center of the hall for warmth and cooking, but without chimneys, the smoke had to find its own way out through vents in the roof or gaps in the walls. This meant the air quality was somewhere between burning forest and forgot to open the flue. On the plus side, the smoke helped preserve the wood and kept insects at bay. On the downside, it often left you with the feeling of having spent the night in a barbecue pit. Speaking of smells, let's not gloss over the olfactory experience of Viking longhouse life. When you're sharing your living space with a family of humans and a menagerie of animals, the resulting aroma is complex. The scent of hay mixed with the earthy musk of livestock, and the occasional human foot odor created an environment that was, shall we say, rich in character. It's the kind of smell that sticks with you, literally, as soap wasn't exactly on the Viking shopping list. But don't let these realities harsh your Viking vibe. Despite the close quarters and sensory overload, these longhouses were the heart of Viking community life. They were places of storytelling, feasting, and strategizing. Here, tales of epic voyages and battles were recounted by the glow of the fire, fostering a sense of unity and identity among those who called it home. The Longhouse was a testament to the Viking spirit, sturdy, practical, and built to endure. As you start your day, stepping outside into the crisp morning air, you're greeted by the sight of rolling hills and distant fjords. The Viking world may have been harsh, but it was also breathtakingly beautiful. And as you take in the view, you can't help but admire the resilience of those who lived their lives within these wooden walls. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, crafting a legacy that would echo through history long after the smoke had cleared. As you breathe in the brisk morning air, you might expect to be greeted by the scent of sizzling bacon or a fresh brewed coffee. Sorry to burst your breakfast bubble, but you're more likely to catch a whiff of porridge simmering over the communal hearth. Welcome to the Viking diet, where hardy, practical, and occasionally bland are the three main food groups. Forget the image of endless feasts with rivers of mead and mutton. That's more saga than reality. Vikings were practical folks, and their diet reflected their environment. Think more farm-to-table and less all-you-can-eat buffet. Let's dive into what was actually on the Viking menu. Spoiler alert, if you're a fan of variety, you might be left wanting. Grains like barley, rye, and oats dominated the Viking diet. These were the powerhouses of the Scandinavian pantry, grown in the short, intense summers. The Vikings were savvy agriculturalists, using techniques like crop rotation to squeeze every bit of nourishment from the land. So when you sit down to your first meal of the day, expect a generous bowl of gruel, a dish so humble even oatmeal might turn up its nose. Now let's talk protein. Sure, Vikings enjoyed meat, but it wasn't the everyday affair you might think. Livestock like cattle, sheep, and pigs were valuable assets, often kept more for their milk, wool, and breeding potential than for their meat. Slaughtering them was a calculated decision, not a daily occurrence. Instead, fish, particularly herring and cod, were the more common fare. Don't underestimate the humble fish. It was central to the Viking diet and economy. With a coastline that would make a geographer weep with joy, the Norse were expert fishermen. They salted, dried, and smoked fish, creating a portable protein source that powered voyages across stormy seas. And speaking of travel, let's not forget about trade. The Vikings were master traders, turning their seafaring skills into a thriving economy that stretched from the icy waters of the North Atlantic to the bustling markets of the Byzantine Empire. Their longships weren't just for raids. They were the cargo ships of their day, filled with goods like furs, wool, and yes, that ubiquitous dried fish. They bartered these for luxury items like silk, spices, and wine, proving that even the toughest Norsemen had a taste for the finer things in life. But before we glamorize Viking trade too much, let's get back to the gritty reality of life on the homestead. The harsh climate meant that every harvest was a gamble, with the threat of crop failure looming large. It was a precarious existence, where a bad season could mean the difference between survival and starvation. This wasn't a society of endless abundance. It was one of careful management and resourcefulness. Vikings preserved food through smoking, drying, and fermenting, ensuring that their larder was stocked for the long, dark winters. Now, let's debunk the myth of the Viking feast. Sure, feasts did happen, and they were occasions of great merriment, with storytelling, games, and yes, plenty of mead. But they were special events, not everyday occurrences. These gatherings were tied to specific occasions like weddings, funerals, or successful raids. Daily meals were far more modest, and often eaten on the go as work took precedence over leisure. The Viking economy was built on hard work and practicality, not on a continuous cycle of revelry. As for that legendary Viking mead, it was certainly enjoyed, but it wasn't a staple of every meal. Mead, a fermented honey drink, was a luxury, consumed on special occasions. Everyday beverages were more likely to be ale or buttermilk, brewed from local ingredients. And while we're debunking, let's address the notion of Vikings as unrelenting meat-eaters. In truth, they were opportunistic eaters, consuming what was available and sustainable. In the Viking world, food was a testament to their resilience and adaptability. They turned their challenging environment into a landscape of opportunity, mastering the art of survival with the resources at hand. As you sit by the hearth, spooning another mouthful of porridge, and not just eating breakfast, you're partaking in a tradition that sustained a people known for their strength and endurance. And as the morning sun rises, casting its light over the fjords, you can't help but admire the Viking spirit, undaunted, resourceful, and ever ready to face the challenges of the day. So next time someone waxes poetic about the romanticized Viking feast, you can nod knowingly and share a dose of reality. Vikings were masters of survival, not gluttony. As you finish your meal and prepare to tackle the day's tasks, remember that the Viking diet was a reflection of their world, one of scarcity and abundance, hardship and celebration, all rolled into one. There's a lesson in there somewhere, perhaps about appreciating the simple things or finding strength in adversity. But let's not get too philosophical before lunch. We've got a Longhouse to run, trade routes to navigate, and a legacy to uphold. Welcome to the Viking life, where every meal is a story, and every day is an adventure. As you ponder the Viking diet, with a spoonful of porridge in hand, it's time to step away from the hearth and dive into the political heart of Viking life. Midday is when the social and political gears start grinding, and it's here that you'll meet the Jarl, the big cheese of the Longhouse, if you will. This isn't just some guy with a fancy hat. The Jarl was the linchpin holding the community together. Think of him as the CEO of Viking Inc. But instead of quarterly reports, he's more concerned with managing the local farm yields and keeping the peace. The Jarl wielded power not through brute force or fear most of the time, but through a complex web of alliances, oaths, and mutual obligations. In a society where honor was as valuable as a stockpile of salted herring, the Jarl's authority came from his ability to lead by example and maintain the delicate balance between being a warrior and a diplomat. His Longhouse was not just a family home, it was the epicenter of Viking governance. Here, matters of trade, law, and occasionally the odd marriage proposal were discussed over hornfuls of ale. Let's bust a myth while we're at it. The Vikings weren't just a bunch of marauding brutes with axes for hands. Sure, they had their moments of glory and gore, but they also had a sophisticated legal system that would make your head spin faster than a berserker on a battlefield. Enter the Thing, and no, we're not talking about an unspeakable monstrosity from a horror flick. The Thing was an assembly where free men gathered to resolve disputes and make decisions. Picture it as a cross between a town hall meeting and a very intense group therapy session. The Thing was the democratic heart of Viking society, where every free man had a voice, though the volume of that voice often depended on his social standing. This was no free-for-all brawl, but a structured affair where laws were proposed, judgments passed, and grievances aired. It's where you'd settle that pesky land dispute with your neighbor without resorting to a sword fight in the cabbage patch. The Thing could be held in fields, at sacred sites, or sometimes even on small islets, because who doesn't love a bit of scenic backdrop while airing their grievances? Now, if you're thinking this sounds suspiciously civilized for a bunch of so-called barbarians, you're not alone. Viking governance was, in many ways, ahead of its time. They understood that stability and order were crucial for trade and prosperity. After all, you can't exactly barter for silk and spices when your village is knee-deep in strife. This need for order was reflected in their legal codes, which were as comprehensive as they were pragmatic. Crimes were met with fines rather than imprisonment, making it more about restitution than retribution, something our modern justice systems could maybe take a page from. However, let's not get too carried away with this rosy vision of Viking jurisprudence. The system wasn't perfect, and justice could sometimes be as unpredictable as the North Atlantic weather. The Jarl, as the presiding authority, had the unenviable task of ensuring fairness while keeping his own interests in mind. If you think politics today is a minefield, try navigating a political landscape where offending the wrong person might just get you challenged to a duel. And speaking of duels, let's address the elephant, or perhaps the berserker, in the room, the Viking propensity for violence. Yes, Vikings had a reputation for settling their differences with a bit more theatrical flair than your average medieval peasant. But the truth is, most disputes were settled through arbitration and compensation, not bloodshed. The concept of wergild, or man price, was central to their legal system. Essentially, if you wronged someone, you paid a fine proportional to the damage done, kind of like an early form of personal injury law, minus the TV commercials. But let's not romanticize it too much. Viking justice could be brutal, and punishments for serious crimes like murder or treason were harsh. Outlawry was a common sentence, essentially turning the offender into fair game for anyone with a grudge. It was a fate worse than death for a society so deeply rooted in community and kinship. To be an outlaw was to be stripped of your identity and support network, a lonely existence in a world where survival was a team sport. As for the Jarl, his role extended beyond mere governance. He was also the linchpin in the social hierarchy. Below him were the carls, the freemen who made up the bulk of Viking society, farmers, traders, and warriors who kept the wheels turning. At the bottom were the thralls, the enslaved people who, despite their low status, were integral to the Viking economy. Slavery in Viking society was a harsh reality, an uncomfortable truth that tempers the romanticized image of the noble Norsemen. Thralls could be captured in raids or born into servitude, and while they had some rights, their lives were a far cry from the freedom enjoyed by the carls and jarls. This social structure was fluid, though. A carl could rise to become a jarl through cunning, bravery, or sheer luck, while a jarl could fall from grace just as quickly. It was a meritocracy of sorts, where wealth and social mobility were within reach for those with the skill and tenacity to grasp them. The Vikings were nothing if not opportunistic, and their society reflected this dynamic, ever-changing reality. So next time someone paints the Vikings as nothing more than marauding heathens with no regard for law and order, you can nod wisely and point out that these seafaring adventurers had a firm grasp on governance and justice. They understood that a strong community required more than just strength of arms. It needed laws, leaders, and a shared sense of justice. In a world as harsh and unforgiving as the Viking Age, these were the true foundations of their enduring legacy. As the sun reaches its zenith and the Longhouse buzzes with activity, it's clear that Viking life was as much about governance and social bonds as it was about adventure and conquest. So as you step outside into the midday sun, ready to tackle the challenges of the afternoon, remember that beneath the rough exterior of Viking society lay a sophisticated network of relationships, responsibilities, and rules. And in the grand saga of history, that might just be their greatest achievement of all. As the afternoon sun casts long shadows over the Longhouse, it's time to swap politics for a bit of craftsmanship. Because Vikings weren't just about swinging swords. They were also about swinging hammers, needles, and chisels. Yeah, the Norse were the original DIY enthusiasts, crafting everything from textiles to intricate wood carvings. They might have been raiding your coastal town last Tuesday, but today they're meticulously weaving a tapestry or carving a dragon-headed prow for their longship. Let's start with textiles, because who doesn't love a good yarn? Viking women were the unsung heroes of the textile world, spinning and weaving like their lives depended on it, which, considering the Scandinavian chill, they kind of did. The Viking wardrobe was all about layers, tunics, cloaks, and trousers made from wool, linen, and even silk if you were feeling particularly fancy. Viking women used drop spindles to spin wool into thread, and loom weights to weave it into fabric, creating garments that were as functional as they were stylish. And before you roll your eyes at what might sound like the medieval equivalent of knitting circle gossip, consider this. Textiles were so valuable They were often used as currency. Now, let's unravel a common misconception. Viking homes weren't just cold, utilitarian spaces. Sure, the Longhouse was primarily about survival, but the Vikings also had an eye for design. They adorned their homes with woven tapestries and carved wooden decor, showcasing the artistry that was a point of pride and a symbol of status. Imagine a longhouse with intricately carved wooden beams, each telling its own story of gods, beasts, and heroes. Because why have plain beams when you can have Thor battling Jörmungandr etched into your ceiling? And speaking of woodwork, let's talk about carving, because the Vikings took it to an art form that would make Michelangelo nod in approval. Wood was abundant in Scandinavia, making it the go-to material for everything from ships to spoons. Viking craftsmen were adept at creating intricate designs, from the serpentine dragons on ship prows to the delicate patterns on household items. These carvings weren't just decorative, they were statements of identity and power. A well-carved ship could intimidate an enemy before a single arrow was fired. But it wasn't all about looking good. Viking craftsmanship had a practical side, too, deeply tied to the economy. These artisans weren't just crafting for local use. They were creating goods that would travel farther than most of us do on our summer vacations. Viking artifacts have been found as far away as the Middle East, a testament to their widespread trade networks. From combs and brooches to swords and shields, Viking goods were hot commodities in the bustling markets of Europe and beyond. They traded everything from furs and walrus ivory to those snazzy textiles, proving that their talents were as diverse as their trading routes. Now, if you're picturing a world where every Viking home is a gallery of art and craftsmanship, let's dial it back a notch. This isn't IKEA, folks. The reality was most homes displayed their wealth and craftsmanship according to their means. The average Viking may not have lived in an art gallery, but even the humblest of abodes had touches of personal craftsmanship. It was a matter of pride and practicality, where beauty and utility went hand in hand. But of course, with all this craftsmanship came a bit of competition. Viking artisans, much like today's Instagram influencers, knew the value of a good reputation. A skilled craftsman could find himself in high demand, called upon to create everything from ceremonial weapons to ornate jewelry. And speaking of jewelry, Vikings loved their bling. Arm rings, brooches, and necklaces were not just adornments, but also a way to display wealth and allegiance. These pieces were often made from silver or gold, and sometimes even imported materials, because nothing says successful raid quite like a bit of Byzantine gold around your neck. And let's not forget about shipbuilding, the pinnacle of Viking craftsmanship. These weren't just boats. They were masterpieces of engineering and design, allowing the Norse to navigate the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic and beyond. Each longship was a testament to the Vikings' understanding of the sea and their innovative spirit. Constructed using the clinker method, where planks overlapped like scales, these ships were both flexible and strong, capable of withstanding rough seas and shallow rivers alike. A well-crafted ship was the pride of any Viking community, serving as a symbol of their strength and reach. As the afternoon wears on, you begin to see how craftsmanship wasn't just a pastime for the Vikings. It was a way of life intertwined with their survival, economy, and identity. These artisans were the backbone of a society that prized resilience and creativity, proving that even in a world often seen as harsh and brutal, there was room for beauty and innovation. So next time someone waxes poetic about the Vikings as mere raiders and warriors, remind them of the skilled hands that crafted the ships, tools, and textiles that were just as essential to their legacy as any saga or battle. As the sun dips towards the horizon, casting a golden glow over the Longhouse, it's clear that Viking craftsmanship was more than just a means to an end. It was a testament to their ingenuity, a celebration of their culture, and a crucial component of their economy. And while we tend to focus on the swords and ships, it's the everyday artistry that truly tells the story of Viking life, a story of resilience, resourcefulness, and a touch of artistic flair. With the evening approaching, there's still much to uncover about these remarkable people. But for now, let's admire the handiwork of a society that turned survival into an art form. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting shadows that stretch like Norse sagas across the landscape, the Viking Longhouse settles into the evening's rhythm. It's a time for reflection, not just on the day's toil, but on the legacy of this remarkable lifestyle. These longhouses weren't just rustic abodes, they were the blueprints for community living, a concept that has echoed through time into our modern world. Let's dive into how these structures influenced everything from architecture to social systems. And while we're at it, let's shake off some of those pop culture cobwebs. First off, let's get one thing straight. Viking longhouses were not merely the medieval equivalents of frat houses, despite the communal living vibe. These were sophisticated structures that laid the groundwork for communal spaces in architecture. The idea of a single, multi-purpose room where people gather to share stories, meals, and warmth. That's not just Viking. That's practically every open-plan design in a Scandinavian furniture catalogue. The Longhouse's open design, with its central hearth and communal sleeping areas, was a precursor to modern open-concept living, where spaces flow into one another without the tyranny of walls. But before you start thinking of the Vikings as the original interior designers, remember that this layout wasn't about aesthetics. It was about survival. In a world where winter could make Siberia look like a tropical getaway, the Longhouse was designed to conserve warmth and resources. The thick walls of wattle and daub weren't just rustic chic. They were a necessity, providing insulation against the biting cold. And the communal living arrangement, it was less about bonding over board games and more about ensuring everyone stayed alive through the long, dark nights. Now, let's address the myth of the Viking as a helmet-wearing, axe-swinging brute. The image of horned helmets is about as historically accurate as a Hollywood history flick. In reality, Viking warriors wore helmets that were far more practical, designed for battle rather than theatrical flair. The horned helmet idea, while visually striking, is a 19th century invention courtesy of romanticized operas and paintings. The truth is, Viking warfare was less about fashion statements and more about brute survival and strategy. They were warriors, yes, but also traders, farmers, and settlers, deeply invested in a complex society that valued negotiation as much as it did valor. Speaking of complexity, Viking society was more nuanced than the bloodthirsty narratives would have you believe. Their legal systems, like the Thing, were early examples of democratic processes. Imagine a society where disputes were settled through dialogue and consensus rather than duels and vendettas. It's a notion as quaint as it is progressive, especially when you consider that this was a time when most of Europe was still grappling with feudal overlords and absolute monarchs. Let's not forget the Viking influence on our social fabric. Their concept of kinship and community responsibility has rippled through history. The idea that a community is only as strong as its weakest link is a Viking legacy, one that has found its way into modern social systems and community-oriented policies. This wasn't just about survival. It was about fostering a sense of belonging and mutual support, a blueprint for societies that value social safety nets and communal cooperation. Of course, we can't wrap this up without a nod to the Viking spirit of exploration. Their voyages were not just testosterone-fueled raids. They were also about discovery and trade. Vikings were the original globetrotters, and their daring exploits laid the groundwork for future explorers. They reached as far as North America, a feat that would remain a footnote in history until Columbus's more publicized journey some 500 years later. Their legacy of exploration isn't just about conquering new lands, but also about cultural exchange and the blending of worlds, a precursor to globalization. As night falls and the Longhouse settles into the quiet hum of evening activities, let's take a moment to dissect those Viking myths that have permeated pop culture. The Viking Age wasn't just about pillaging and plundering. It was a time of cultural richness and societal evolution. The romantic image of the Viking as a wild, untamed warrior is only part of the story. Behind the axes and longships was a society that valued storytelling, craftsmanship, and community, a society that laid the groundwork for many of the social structures we take for granted today. So, as you drift off to sleep, dreaming of fjords and sagas, remember that the legacy of the Viking Longhouse is all around you. It's in the open-plan homes we cherish, the democratic principles we uphold, and the adventurous spirit that drives us to explore the unknown. The Vikings were not just raiders of the seas, but architects of a social and cultural legacy that continues to inspire. They remind us that beneath the myths lies a reality that is richer, more complex, and infinitely more human. And that, perhaps, is the greatest saga of all. Beneath the scorching sun of the Mesopotamian plains, you find yourself navigating the bustling streets of Nineveh, the capital of the ancient Assyrian Empire. It's 900 BCE, and you're smack in the middle of a civilization that's perfected the art of empire building, complete with all the bureaucratic chaos and military muscle that entails. The Assyrians are like the overachievers of the ancient world, and you're about to see why. The city's a labyrinth of mud-brick walls and ziggurats that loom like prehistoric skyscrapers, casting shadows as long as the tales that will one day be told about them. Nineveh isn't just a city, it's a statement. This place screams, "We're here to stay," louder than a rock concert in a library. At its heart, you'll find the king, not just any king, but the kind who's involved in everything from arranging trade routes to orchestrating divine rituals. This guy's got a resume that would make even the most ambitious modern CEO blush. Let's talk societal hierarchy. Picture a pyramid, not the Egyptian kind, though those are cool too, but a social one. At the top, you've got the king, the big kahuna. His word is law, and when he's not busy leading his armies or performing religious ceremonies, he's probably deciding the fate of nations over breakfast. Beneath him, you've got a layer of nobility and priests who keep the spiritual and administrative wheels turning. They're the equivalent of the high-powered executives and spiritual advisors, ensuring the king's policies reach every corner of the empire. Then there's the middle class, a bustling crowd of merchants and artisans, the ancient world's version of the small business owners and craftspeople. They're the gears in the clockwork of daily life, keeping the economy ticking while dreaming of moving up the social ladder. And at the base, you've got the farmers and laborers, the unsung heroes who, quite literally, break their backs to keep the empire fed and functioning. It's a tough gig, but someone's got to do it. Now, let's not romanticize it too much. Life here isn't all about glamorous banquets and epic battles. It's gritty with a side of relentless toil. Taxes are a thing, a big thing. The Assyrians are meticulous record keepers, documenting everything from sheep counts to grain harvests. A scribe's tablet from this period reads like an accountant's ledger, filled with numbers that would make modern tax forms look like child's play. The Assyrian economy thrives on agriculture and trade, with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers serving as the ancient highways of commerce. Speaking of highways, let's not forget the empire-building tactics. Assyria's expansion is no accident. It's a calculated move. The king, think of him as the ultimate multitasker, oversees a military machine that's as efficient as it is ruthless. They're not just about conquering, they're about integrating and administrating. Each new territory is a fresh source of resources, soldiers, and let's be honest, taxes. It's a win-win-win, unless you're on the receiving end of an Assyrian campaign. The king's role is a balancing act between war strategies and religious duties. He's part general, part high priest, and all ruler. When the king isn't in battle, he's in the temple, ensuring that the gods are pleased and the omens favorable. His divine mandate is what keeps the empire on its feet, or at least that's what the propaganda tablets would have you believe. The Assyrians are masters of public relations, spinning tales of divine favor and invincibility to keep everyone, from the common farmer to the nobility, in line. But let's not kid ourselves. It's not all divine intervention and glory. The realities of ruling an empire are harsh. You've got rebellions to quash, famines to manage, and the ever-present threat of betrayal lurking in the shadows of the royal court. The king's life, while enviable on the surface, is a high-stakes game of strategy, where one wrong move can topple the whole house of cards. In the end, it's a world where power is king, literally and figuratively, and everyone's vying for a piece of it. The Assyrians' legacy is one of ambition, innovation, and yes, a fair bit of brutality. But it's this complex tapestry of politics, religion, and warfare that sets the stage for the strange rituals and customs you'll soon unravel. So strap in, because the Assyrian ride is just getting started, and it's nothing short of a historical roller coaster. Now, let's dive into the divine drama of Assyrian life, where gods were less distant beings and more like meddling neighbors with a penchant for theatrics. The Assyrians were a polytheistic bunch, meaning they had a god for everything. You stubbed your toe, there's probably a deity for that. Their pantheon was as crowded as a sale at a vintage record store. The gods, with their whims and wishes, were woven into the very fabric of daily life, like an omnipresent Wi-Fi signal that you couldn't quite disconnect from. These were not just celestial beings. They were active participants in the Assyrian saga, influencing everything from the harvest to warfare. Let's not sugarcoat it. The gods were demanding, and keeping them happy was as crucial as paying your taxes, and probably just as complicated. Central to this celestial soap opera was the Akiru festival, the Assyrian New Year celebration. Picture this, a 12-day extravaganza that made modern New Year's Eve parties look like quiet evenings by comparison. Held in early spring to coincide with the barley harvest, the Akiru was less about resolutions and more about reaffirmations of the king's divine right to rule, that is. This festival was a grand spectacle, complete with parades, sacrifices, and rituals that would make a Hollywood director envious. The Akiru wasn't just a party. It was a political and religious powerhouse, a tool for social cohesion and royal propaganda. The king, in all his adorned glory, would publicly reenact the cosmic battle between Marduk, the chief god, and the chaos monster Tiamat. This wasn't just theater for theater's sake. It was a symbolic affirmation of cosmic order, with the king playing the starring role. After all, nothing says, "I've got this," quite like slaying a mythical beast in front of your subjects. This festival also served as a yearly reset button, purging the community of the past year's sins. Think of it as a spiritual spring cleaning, with rituals designed to ensure the gods' favor for the coming year. One particularly peculiar aspect involved the ritual of humiliation, where the king would symbolically relinquish his power, only to regain it, reinforced by the gods. It's a bit like handing in your resignation just to get promoted, high stakes and theatrics all wrapped into one. But don't be fooled by the pageantry. Beneath the layers of ceremony lay serious social and political maneuvering. The Akiru was crucial for maintaining social order and reinforcing the king's divine mandate. It was as much about politics as it was about piety, and the spectacle ensured that everyone knew who was in charge, both on earth and in the heavens. Beyond the Akiru, the Assyrian religious calendar was filled with a colorful array of rituals, each dedicated to appeasing a pantheon of gods with names as intricate as the rituals themselves. There was Asher, the chief deity, and Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. Talk about a multitasking mandate. Then there was Enlil, the god of wind, and Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom, a favorite among scribes who probably whispered a prayer or two while tallying tax records. The temples, or ziggurats, served as the epicenters of these divine dealings. These architectural marvels were not just places of worship. They were the banks, schools, and sometimes even hospitals of their day. The priests who ran these temples wielded considerable power, acting as intermediaries between the gods and the people. They were the spiritual executives who ensured that the divine will was interpreted, and let's be honest, enforced. Rituals in these temples could be as complex as a modern tax code. Offerings were made, sacrifices performed, and omens read, all in an effort to decipher the gods' ever-mysterious messages. Animal sacrifices were common. Sheep, goats, and even the occasional bull found themselves at the center of these spiritual transactions. The entrails of these animals were believed to hold divine messages, a sort of cosmic telegram service, if you will. The priests would interpret these signs, guiding everything from military campaigns to agricultural practices. But here's where it gets interesting. While these rituals might seem archaic to us, they were rooted in a sophisticated understanding of their world. The Assyrians were keen observers of natural phenomena, and their rituals often reflected an attempt to make sense of the unpredictable forces of nature. The myths and legends that surrounded these rituals were, in many ways, early attempts at explaining the inexplicable. However, it wasn't all incense and enlightenment. The darker side of Assyrian religion included practices that would raise eyebrows today. Certain rituals demanded human participation in ways that were less than voluntary. The myth of the sacrificial virgin, while largely debunked, speaks to the sensational tales that have long surrounded these ancient customs. More often than not, these stories are the product of later interpretations or exaggerations by rival cultures, eager to paint the Assyrians as barbaric. In reality, the Assyrians, like many ancient cultures, were a product of their time, pragmatic in their spirituality, using religious rituals to navigate the complexities of empire building. They understood that religion was as much about social control and political power as it was about spiritual enlightenment. By keeping the guards satisfied, they maintained the delicate balance of power that kept their empire running smoothly. In essence, Assyrian religious rituals were a grand performance, a blend of belief and politics, designed to sustain the social order and legitimize the king's rule. The guards might have been the stars, but it was the king and his priests who directed the show. As we continue to unravel the intricacies of Assyrian life, keep in mind that the line between myth and reality was as blurry then as it is now. Stay tuned, for there's more to these ancient tales than meets the eye. Speaking of balancing acts, let's shift gears from the celestial drama of guards and rituals to something a bit more down-to-earth, the Assyrian economy. You might think ancient economies are all about bartering goats for grain, but Assyria was playing a whole different ball game. This was an empire built on a robust economic backbone, with trade routes as vital to its survival as the king's crown. First, let's talk trade routes. The Assyrians were like the ancient world's logistical masterminds. Think of them as the FedEx of the Fertile Crescent, except their packages were spices, textiles, and all sorts of goods that kept the empire's coffers brimming. Their trade network spanned from Anatolia to Egypt, with caravans trudging through dusty roads, loaded with everything from lapis lazuli to precious metals. It was a bit like the Silk Road, but with more clay tablets and fewer silk pajamas. Now, you might wonder, how did they keep all these trade routes running smoothly? Well, it wasn't just fortune cookies and friendly handshakes. The Assyrians were meticulous record keepers, with scribes noting every transaction like accountants on a caffeine buzz. Taxes were a big part of this economic equation, and the Assyrians loved them more than a dog loves a good scratch behind the ears. They taxed everything: land, livestock, goods, even labor. If it existed, it was probably taxed. And then there's the labor force, the unsung heroes who toiled under the Mesopotamian sun. These were the folks who built the roads, tilled the fields, and crafted the goods that fueled the Assyrian economy. Picture a society where the gap between the haves and the have-nots was wider than the Euphrates at flood stage. At the top, you had the king and his nobles, living in palatial splendor. Their homes were lavish affairs, dripping with luxury like a chocolate fountain at a wedding. Meanwhile, the common laborers lived in mud-brick houses, working from dawn till dusk just to make ends meet. Here's where we start to debunk the romanticized view of Assyrian wealth. Sure, the palaces were grand, with walls adorned with intricate carvings and floors paved with polished stone. But for every luxurious banquet enjoyed by the elite, there were countless workers sweating it out in the fields or crafting goods in workshops. The wealth of Assyria was built on the backs of these laborers, and life for them was as hard as the bricks they laid. The Assyrian economy was a well-oiled machine, but it wasn't without its squeaky wheels. Rebellions and uprisings were a constant threat, often sparked by economic strain or harsh taxation. Think of these revolts as the ancient version of a workers' strike, only with more swords and fewer picket signs. The king and his officials had to walk a fine line, balancing the demands of an expanding empire with the needs of a restless populace. But let's not get too bogged down in the grim realities of ancient economics. There's a certain allure to the Assyrian tale, with its grandiose palaces and bustling trade routes. It's easy to get swept up in the romance of it all, imagining the clatter of market stalls and the clinking of coins in a scribe's counting room. Yet, beneath the surface, the reality was far more complex, a world where power and wealth were as fleeting as the seasonal floods that nourished the fields. In the grand tapestry of history, the Assyrian Empire stands out as a testament to human ambition and ingenuity. Their economic prowess laid the groundwork for a civilization that, while brutal at times, was also breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. As we continue our journey through the strange rituals and customs of the Assyrians, remember that every carved stone and recorded tablet tells a story, not just of kings and conquerors, but of the everyday people who lived, worked, and struggled beneath the shadow of empire. So, as we leave the bustling streets of Nineveh behind, let's keep our eyes peeled for the next chapter in this ancient saga, a tale that is as much about the people who walked its corridors as the rulers who sat upon its thrones. Stay tuned, for the Assyrian adventure is far from over, and there are still mysteries to unravel and stories to tell. As we pivot from the bustling streets and economic machinations of Nineveh, let's march straight into the heart of what made the Assyrians truly legendary. Or, depending on your perspective, infamous, their military prowess. Forget the romanticized notion of soldiers in gleaming armor standing shoulder to shoulder like extras in a Hollywood epic. The Assyrians were the ancient world's equivalent of a military-industrial complex, and their approach to warfare was as psychological as it was physical. First up, let's talk hardware. The Assyrian war machine was a marvel of ancient engineering, deploying iron weaponry when many of their neighbors were still swinging bronze. Think of it as an ancient arms race, with the Assyrians standing at the podium. They had chariots that could slice through enemy lines like a hot knife through goat butter, cavalry units that moved faster than a rumor, and a corps of engineers who could throw together a siege ramp before you could say, "Pass the catapult." But it wasn't just about having the biggest, baddest toys on the battlefield. The Assyrians understood that war was as much about the mind as it was about muscle. Enter psychological warfare, Assyrian style. Their campaigns often began with an intimidating show of force, a kind of shock and awe precursor that would make even the most stalwart city-state think twice about resisting. They'd send out messages, not so much in parchment as in person, flaunting their might and promising the kind of devastation that made surrender sound like a pretty sweet deal. Take the siege of Lachish in 701 BCE. King Sennacherib, he of the destroyed 46 cities fame, brought his full arsenal to bear against this Judean city. The siege was depicted in graphic detail on his palace walls, a sort of ancient Instagram post designed to go viral. The message was clear: resist, and your fate is sealed. Your walls breached, your people dispersed, and your leaders flayed. Yes, flayed. The Assyrians had a penchant for skinning their enemies alive, which is less art of war and more nightmare fuel. Now, let's debunk the myth of Assyrian invincibility. Sure, they were formidable, but they weren't infallible. There were defeats, like the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, where a coalition of 12 kings, including the Israelites, managed to halt the Assyrian advance. It was a rare moment where the underdogs had their day, and it showed that even the mightiest could be checked. The Assyrians were brought to a standstill, proving that numbers and unity could occasionally outmatch sheer force. And speaking of unity, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the elephants not in the room. Unlike the later Persian and Carthaginian armies, the Assyrians didn't employ war elephants. They weren't exactly charging into battle on elephant back, like some ancient Hannibal Lecter. They preferred the horsepower of their chariots and the dexterity of their cavalry, leaving the pachyderms to the pages of later military history. But back to the psychological edge. The Assyrians had a knack for turning their enemies' morale into mashed dates. They'd established spy networks to sow discord and confusion behind enemy lines. They understood the power of propaganda, using it to amplify their victories and minimize their losses. It was a strategy that kept many a rival king up at night, wondering if their allies were as steadfast as they claimed. Economically, these military campaigns were a two-edged sword. On one hand, successful conquests brought in tribute that swelled the Assyrian coffers: gold, silver, livestock, and a parade of exotic goods that made Nineveh a bustling hub of wealth. On the other, the constant state of warfare drained resources and demanded a steady supply of fresh soldiers. The empire was a beast that needed feeding, and every campaign was a gamble, one that could just as easily lead to riches as to ruin. And then there's the human cost. Behind the grand strategies and triumphal arches were the soldiers, drawn from every corner of the empire. They were the cogs in the military machine, fighting for a king they might never see, in lands they could barely imagine. For them, war wasn't a glorious adventure. It was a brutal reality, one where survival was as uncertain as the shifting sands beneath their feet. So, while the Assyrians were undoubtedly the superpower of their age, their empire was built on a foundation as fragile as it was formidable. Each victory brought new challenges, and every defeat a reminder of mortality. Their legacy is one of power, yes, but also of the volatile nature of empire, a lesson as relevant today as it was in the tumultuous days of the Assyrian kings. As we wrap up our exploration of Assyrian military might, remember that their tale is far from over. We've seen the grandeur and the grit, the myth and the reality. But there are still more layers to peel back, more stories to unearth, and more truths to uncover. So, stay tuned, because the Assyrian saga is still unfolding, and there are many more mysteries left to explore. So, while we've unraveled the Assyrian saga with its gritty conquests and divine dramas, let's pivot to their legacy, what they left behind after the dust from their chariots settled. First, the empire's decline, the proverbial fall from grace that seems to be the inevitable chapter in any superpower's biography. The Assyrians, despite their military brawn and divine mandates, weren't immune to the classic pitfalls of overextension and internal discord. The Assyrian Empire, at its zenith around 671 BCE, was as vast as it was varied, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. But like a stretched rubber band, it was bound to snap. Constant warfare, while initially filling the coffers, eventually drained resources and morale. Maintaining such a sprawling empire required more than just an iron fist. It needed an endless supply of soldiers, administrators, and crucially, loyalty, a commodity that became increasingly scarce. Internally, the Assyrian kings had to juggle power dynamics with their nobles, who were sometimes more of a threat than the enemy at the gates. The centralized power structure, while effective at times, also meant that when the center wobbled, everything else toppled like a line of clay bricks. The empire became a victim of its own success, burdened by the same grandiosity that once propelled it to greatness. Externally, they faced mounting pressure from neighboring powers, each eager to chip away at Assyrian dominance. The Medes and Babylonians, once subjects or allies, became formidable foes, leading to a critical coalition that would spell the end for the Assyrians. The final nail in the empire's coffin came in 612 BCE, when Nineveh, the jewel of Assyria, fell to a combined force of Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians. It was a dramatic, albeit predictable, collapse, like watching a Jenga tower shudder before the inevitable crash. From the ashes of Assyria's fall rose new powers, but the echoes of Assyrian achievements resonated through history. Their military tactics influenced later empires. The Persian Empire, for instance, adopted and adapted many Assyrian practices, refining them into an even more formidable machine. The art of siege warfare, psychological intimidation, and the use of iron weaponry. These were Assyrian signatures that left an indelible mark on the warfare playbook. Politically, the Assyrians may have been brutal, but they were also bureaucratically innovative. Their administrative techniques, from extensive record-keeping to the development of a postal system, laid the groundwork for future statecraft. The Babylonians and Persians took these innovations and ran with them, creating the bureaucratic backbone from which modern governance systems would eventually evolve. Culturally, the Assyrians contributed to a rich tapestry of mythology and literature, their legends swirling into the collective consciousness of the ancient Near East. The epic of Gilgamesh, though originating in earlier Sumerian tradition, found a home in Assyrian libraries, influencing literary traditions far beyond Mesopotamia. Libraries like the one at Nineveh, assembled by the erudite King Ashurbanipal, preserved countless texts, acting as time capsules of human thought and creativity. In terms of infrastructure, the Assyrians were the master builders of their time. Their cities, with their grand palaces and towering ziggurats, inspired awe and imitation. The urban planning of Nineveh and other Assyrian cities served as blueprints for subsequent urban developments, introducing concepts of centralized government complexes and organized street grids that echoed through the ages. On the religious front, the Assyrians' pantheon and rituals might seem archaic, but they were pivotal in shaping the spiritual landscape of the region. The blending of divine and royal authority became a template for later rulers who claimed divine right, a notion that would travel through time to medieval Europe and beyond. So, what can modern society glean from the rise and fall of this ancient powerhouse? For starters, the Assyrian story is a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the importance of adaptability. Their rigidity in governance and reliance on military might, without corresponding innovations in diplomacy and statecraft, ultimately led to their undoing. It's a timeless lesson in the dangers of overreach and the necessity of balance between aggression and administration. Moreover, the Assyrians remind us that behind every grand empire are the individuals, the architects, scribes, soldiers, and farmers who build and sustain it. Their contributions, though often overshadowed by tales of kings and conquests, are the real backbone of history. The rise of any civilization is as much about its people as it is about its rulers, a perspective we could use more of in today's leader-centric narratives. In wrapping up our Assyrian Odyssey, we find that their legacy is one of paradoxes, brutal yet brilliant, destructive yet innovative. They were the architects of an empire that, while ultimately doomed, paved the way for future civilizations. Their story is not just one of power and downfall, but of cultural fusion and lasting influence, a testament to the complexity and resilience of human endeavor. So, the next time you find yourself in the corridors of a museum, staring at an Assyrian relief or reading an ancient cuneiform tablet, remember the layers of history and human ambition they represent. The Assyrians may no longer walk the earth, but their echoes still reverberate through the halls of human achievement, a fascinating reminder of where we've been and where we might be headed. Otto von Bismarck's early life is a bit like a wild college movie, minus the cinematic ending credits, and with a lot more sword fights. Here's a guy who went from turning lecture halls into his own personal duel arenas to becoming the Iron Chancellor of a newly unified Germany. But before we dive into his political genius, let's rewind to his rather chaotic youth, where his idea of extracurricular activities involved more saber-rattling than student council meetings. Born on April 1, 1815, in Schönhausen, Bismarck was primed from the start for a life less ordinary. Maybe it was the April Fool's birthday that set the tone, but young Otto had an appetite for mischief that could rival any frat house legend. Fast forward to his university days, and you'll find him at the University of Göttingen in 1832, where he quickly earned a reputation that was less about academic excellence and more about his ability to chug beer and challenge people to duels. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Dueling in 19th century Germany was practically a social sport, a rite of passage for many young aristocrats. Bismarck, however, took it to a whole new level. He reportedly fought in at least 26 duels during his time at Göttingen and later at the University of Berlin. These weren't just scuffles over spilt beer. They were serious affairs, with swords, scars, and the occasional severed limb. It was the 1800s equivalent of a Twitter feud, but with more blood and less character limits. So why was Bismarck so fond of dueling? Partly, it was about honor, a commodity more valuable than gold in his aristocratic circles. But it was also about the thrill, the adrenaline rush that comes with facing off against another person in a contest of wit, skill, and nerve. And let's be honest, Bismarck liked to win, whether it was a debate or a duel. His passion for victory was as fierce as his taste for schnapps, and he was known to celebrate a successful duel with copious amounts of it. Speaking of schnapps, Bismarck's university days were also marked by legendary drinking sessions. These weren't your average college keggers. We're talking about marathon boozing that would leave modern drinkers weeping into their craft beers. Bismarck once boasted of drinking 5 bottles of champagne at a sitting, and while he might have been exaggerating, after all, who doesn't embellish their party stories? It's clear he was no lightweight. So, what did all this dueling and drinking teach him? More than you might think. While it sounds like a recipe for disaster, these experiences honed skills that would later become central to his political career. The duels taught him the importance of strategy, precision, and psychological warfare. Knowing when to strike and when to hold back was as crucial in politics as it was in a sword fight. And the drinking, well, Bismarck learned how to hold his own in any social situation, a handy skill when navigating the diplomatic cocktail circuits of Europe. Bismarck's university antics also taught him about the power of image and reputation. He cultivated a persona of rugged individualism and unyielding strength, traits that would later be associated with his political philosophy of Realpolitik, pragmatism over ideology, action over words. This was a man who understood that life, like politics, was a game to be played with cunning and courage. But let's not glamorize it too much. The romantic notion of the swashbuckling student belies the very real dangers of his lifestyle. The scars from his duels were permanent reminders of just how close he often came to disaster. Yet in the crucible of these wild years, Bismarck emerged tempered, if not entirely tamed. He had learned that survival often depended on being just a little bit smarter, a little bit faster, and occasionally a little bit luckier than the next guy. So, as Bismarck stumbled out of university, perhaps with a hangover and a few more scars than he went in with. He carried with him the seeds of his future as a statesman. The reckless young man who once preferred the thrill of a blade to the tedium of a textbook was on his way to becoming the architect of a new Germany, who knew that the path to becoming one of Europe's most formidable political figures would be paved with empty bottles and broken swords. In the end, Bismarck's early years were a testament to the idea that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. As the dust settled on Bismarck's tumultuous university years, the future Iron Chancellor was more than just a collection of scars and hangovers. He was a man on a mission that, surprisingly, didn't involve further duels or drinking contests, but rather a deep dive into the murky waters of politics. Now, you might think that a guy whose most notable skills involved swordplay and schnapps wouldn't be cut out for the delicate art of statecraft, but Bismarck had a few tricks up his sleeve that weren't just for show. First, let's talk about Realpolitik. If you're imagining a German version of Machiavelli in a steel helmet, you're not too far off. Realpolitik was Bismarck's brainchild, a no-nonsense approach to politics where ideology took a backseat to practicality. It was the political equivalent of a barroom brawl, quick, brutal, and effective. Bismarck knew that in the cutthroat world of 19th century European politics, being right didn't count for much if you couldn't also be ruthless. The road to power for Bismarck was paved with careful calculation and the occasional deft maneuver. He started his political career in the Prussian civil service, where his talent for strategy quickly became apparent. But it wasn't until 1862 that Bismarck really hit his stride. Appointed as Minister-President of Prussia by King Wilhelm I, he was given the keys to the political kingdom. And boy, did he know how to drive. Enter the blood and iron speech, a statement so iconic it's practically a brand. Delivered in September 1862, this speech was Bismarck's way of telling the world that Prussia would not be unified through speeches and resolutions alone, but through military might. Take note, because this is where the myth and the man collide. While the phrase blood and iron sounds like something out of a heavy metal album, the reality was more nuanced. The speech was less about glorifying war and more about pointing out that power is often forged in the fires of conflict. Bismarck wasn't some warmongering madman, despite what history textbooks might have you believe. He was a strategist, a chess player who knew that sometimes you had to sacrifice a pawn or two to win the game. His approach to diplomacy was sly, to say the least. He saw Europe as a gigantic chessboard, with each country a piece to be manipulated, outmaneuvered, or, when necessary, knocked off the board entirely. A key part of Bismarck's strategy involved manipulating alliances like a master puppeteer. Here was a man who could convince a cat to swim and a fish to climb a tree if it suited his purposes. Take the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, for instance. Bismarck managed to isolate Austria diplomatically, ensuring that when Prussia finally went to war, Austria stood alone. The victory at the Battle of Königgrätz wasn't just a military triumph. It was a testament to Bismarck's ability to outwit his opponents before a single shot was fired. Yet, Bismarck was no mere warmonger. He understood the economic underpinnings of power and wielded them with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. In the aftermath of the Austro-Prussian War, Bismarck established the North German Confederation, a political entity that was as much about economic integration as it was about military alliance. The Zollverein, a customs union initiated years earlier, laid the groundwork for this economic unity. By 1866, the North German Confederation controlled over 80% of the German-speaking population, and Bismarck was the puppet master pulling the strings. Bismarck's genius lay not just in his ability to wield power, but in his understanding of how power worked. He knew that for a nation to be truly powerful, it needed both a strong economy and a robust military. This dual focus on economic and military strength was the beating heart of his Realpolitik philosophy. The man who had once been a reckless student had transformed into a political titan, with both the foresight to build alliances and the ruthlessness to break them when they no longer served his purposes. While Bismarck was busy crafting his empire, the rest of Europe watched with a mix of admiration and trepidation. The man was a geopolitical maestro, conducting an orchestra of nations, each playing a tune of his choosing. But let's not get carried away with the Bismarck fan club just yet. His manipulations weren't without consequence. The alliances he forged were as fragile as a house of cards, and it wouldn't take much for the whole structure to come crashing down. Bismarck's diplomatic genius was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he managed to keep Europe relatively stable during his tenure, balancing the powers like a tightrope walker on a windy day. On the other, he left behind a legacy of tension and mistrust that would eventually lead to the catastrophic conflicts of the 20th century. It's a classic case of short-term gain meeting long-term pain. But let's not put all the blame on Bismarck's shoulders. The man was a product of his time, a time when the art of diplomacy was as much about deception as it was about dialogue. And in that arena, he was second to none. His ability to manipulate events to his advantage was legendary, a skill that earned him both admiration and animosity in equal measure. As we look back on Bismarck's rise to power, it's clear that his legacy is as complex as the man himself. He was a master of realpolitik, a strategist who understood that in the world of politics, the ends often justified the means. Yet, for all his success, Bismarck was also a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most brilliant political strategies can have unintended consequences. So, what's the takeaway from Bismarck's story so far? In the grand chess game of history, he was a player who knew how to bend the rules to his will. He understood that power was not just about military might or economic strength, but about the ability to control the narrative. And in that respect, Otto von Bismarck was a storyteller of epic proportions, weaving a tale of ambition, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of power. But like all great stories, his was far from over. The stage was set for the next act, one that would see Bismarck continue to shape the destiny of Europe in ways that few could have imagined. Stay tuned, because the Iron Chancellor's legacy is about to get even more interesting. As Bismarck continued to shape the destiny of Europe, his next act was less about military maneuvers and more about a domestic makeover, like a political fixer-upper for the German Empire. Now, if you thought Bismarck's foray was just war and diplomacy, buckle up, because the Iron Chancellor had a surprising soft spot for social reform. Picture this, a conservative aristocrat with more in common with a steel baron than a social worker, laying the groundwork for what we now recognize as the modern welfare state. Talk about irony, right? Let's kick off with Bismarck's health insurance initiative, a revolutionary move in 1883 that seemed as out of character for him as a vegan at a Texas BBQ. But here's the kicker. Bismarck wasn't suddenly channeling Mother Teresa vibes. This was a strategic masterstroke. By providing health insurance to workers, Bismarck aimed to quell the rising tide of socialism that was threatening to sweep across Germany like a political tsunami. Imagine offering a lifeboat to keep your ship from being overtaken by pirates. Smart, right? This health insurance law wasn't just a token gesture. It was a full-blown policy complete with coverage for medical treatment, sick pay, and a network of sickness funds. In essence, Bismarck was saying, hey, workers, don't turn red with socialism. Here's a safety net for you. By 1885, more than 5 million workers were enrolled, a number that would make any modern-day healthcare provider blush with envy. And let's not forget the economic context. Germany was industrializing at breakneck speed, with factories cropping up faster than you could say, revolution. This insurance wasn't just about kindness. It was about keeping the economy humming along smoothly. Bismarck's social welfare policies didn't stop at health insurance. In 1884, he introduced accident insurance, followed by old-age pensions in 1889. That's right. Bismarck was securing the political equivalent of a retirement plan for his citizens. The old-age pension was particularly groundbreaking, offering benefits to workers over 70. Now, 70 might not seem all that old today, but back then, if you made it to 70, you were practically an immortal. But why did Bismarck, a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, embrace such forward-thinking policies? The answer lies in his political pragmatism. By providing a safety net, he hoped to win over the working class and undercut the socialist movement, which was gaining traction faster than a steam engine on full throttle. It was a classic case of keeping your friends close and your political enemies even closer. Bismarck was nothing if not a shrewd operator, adept at playing the long game. While these measures might seem progressive, don't start painting Bismarck as a champion of the proletariat just yet. This was no altruistic crusade. It was a calculated effort to maintain social stability and reinforce his own power. The welfare state was a means to an end, a tool to prevent the kind of upheaval that had rocked other parts of Europe. Bismarck understood that a contented workforce was less likely to revolt, and he was determined to keep the German Empire on an even keel. Switching gears, let's talk about the Kulturkampf, or cultural struggle, where Bismarck decided to lock horns with the Catholic Church. If you thought his domestic policies were audacious, wait till you hear about this showdown. In the 1870, Bismarck launched a campaign to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church in state affairs. At its core, the Kulturkampf was about asserting state power over religious authority, a bold move in a country where Catholicism was as much a part of the cultural fabric as lederhosen and bratwurst. The heart of this conflict was the 1871 proclamation of papal infallibility by the First Vatican Council, a declaration that didn't sit well with Bismarck, who saw it as a direct challenge to state sovereignty. Imagine your neighbor suddenly deciding they're the final authority on everything from your lawn care to your dinner menu. Bismarck wasn't having it. The Kulturkampf saw the introduction of laws that required state approval for clergy appointments and secularized schools. Priests who resisted found themselves behind bars, and religious orders were suppressed. It was a full-scale offensive that aimed to secularize public life and curb the church's influence. But here's the twist. Despite Bismarck's efforts, the Kulturkampf was a strategic misfire. Instead of weakening the Catholic Church, it galvanized the Catholic community, uniting them under the banner of the newly formed Centre Party. Bismarck, who had prided himself on his political acumen, found himself outmaneuvered by the very institution he sought to undermine. The Centre Party became a formidable political force, rallying Catholics across Germany and proving that Bismarck's heavy-handed tactics had backfired spectacularly. In a classic case of if you can't beat them, join them, Bismarck eventually made peace with the Catholic Church. By the late 1870, he realized that continuing the Kulturkampf was politically untenable. He needed the support of the Centre Party to push through his legislation, including his social welfare programs. So, in a move that would make any political strategist proud, Bismarck orchestrated a reconciliation, rolling back many of the anti-Catholic laws and shifting his focus back to more pressing domestic issues. The irony of Bismarck's domestic policies lies in the juxtaposition of a conservative leader laying the foundation for a welfare state and engaging in a cultural war that only served to strengthen his opposition. It's a testament to Bismarck's dual nature as both a visionary and a tactician, capable of crafting policies that would endure long after his time, even as he stumbled in his attempts to control the narrative. His social reforms would set the stage for future generations, influencing the development of the welfare states across Europe. As we wrap up this chapter on Bismarck's domestic policies, it's clear that the Iron Chancellor was a man of contradictions. His legacy is a complex tapestry of ambition and pragmatism, woven with threads of both social progress and political maneuvering. Bismarck's story is far from over, and the next act promises to be just as riveting. Stay tuned, because there's plenty more intrigue to unravel in the unfolding saga of Otto von Bismarck. Speaking of legacies, let's dive into Bismarck's piece de résistance, the unification of Germany. Now, if you're imagining a serene watercolor of states coming together in perfect harmony, think again. This was more like a three-act play featuring deception, diplomacy, and a dash of warfare. Bismarck's foreign policy was the high-stakes poker game of 19th century Europe, and the man played his cards like an ace. First up, Act 1, the Danish War of 1864. Picture this. Denmark decides to annex the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, regions with significant German-speaking populations. Enter Bismarck, stage right, with a plan to exploit this nationalistic fervor. Teaming up with Austria, Prussia declared war on Denmark. It was a brief affair, lasting only about 8 months, but the spoils were sweet. By October 1864, Denmark was defeated, and Prussia and Austria shared the duchies like two kids dividing Halloween candy. But Bismarck, ever the strategist, had already set his sights on the next move. Act 2, The Austro-Prussian War of 1866, or as historians like to call it, the 7 Weeks' War. This was Bismarck's masterclass in isolating enemies. He ensured Austria stood alone by crafting diplomatic agreements with Russia, Italy, and even France. The war kicked off in June 1866 and ended faster than a pop song at just 7 weeks. The decisive Battle of Königgrätz on July 3 was a spectacular display of Prussian military prowess, thanks in large part to their superior railways and the needle gun, a rapid-firing rifle that was the 19th century equivalent of a game-changer. Victory meant Prussia now dominated the German states north of the main river, but Bismarck, in a surprising twist, decided to be magnanimous, or as magnanimous as one can be when you've just trounced your neighbor. He opted not to humiliate Austria, knowing full well that a future alliance might prove beneficial. Instead, he focused on creating the North German Confederation, a political and economic powerhouse that set the stage for a unified Germany. Now, let's set the scene for Act 3, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. This was the grand finale, the crescendo in Bismarck's symphony of unification. The spark, a seemingly innocuous diplomatic spat known as the Ems Dispatch. In July 1870, tensions were already simmering between Prussia and France over the candidacy of a Hohenzollern prince for the Spanish throne. Bismarck, ever the puppet master, released a doctored version of a conversation between King Wilhelm I and the French ambassador, making it seem like both sides had insulted each other. Cue outrage. France, feeling its honor besmirched, declared war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. Napoleon Roman III strutted into this conflict, expecting a swift victory. What he got instead was a strategic smackdown. Bismarck had been prepping for this showdown like a chess grandmaster, ensuring Prussian forces were ready to mobilize at the drop of a helmet. By September 1870, French forces were encircled at Sedan, and Napoleon Roman III himself was captured. It was a catastrophic defeat for France, and a resounding victory for Prussia. With France defeated and Paris under siege, Bismarck seized the moment. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, Wilhelm I was proclaimed emperor of a newly unified Germany. It was a symbolic act loaded with irony and historical significance. Bismarck had turned the tables on France in their own backyard. The Franco-Prussian War was Bismarck's diplomatic magnum opus, and its conclusion marked the dawn of the German Empire. But let's not sugarcoat things. Bismarck's methods were as morally ambiguous as they were effective. The Ems Dispatch was a masterstroke of manipulation, turning a diplomatic blip into a full-blown war. Bismarck's unification of Germany was a triumph of Realpolitik, a testament to the power of cunning over conventional morality. This wasn't a fairy tale ending with everyone living happily ever after. This was a hard-nosed, pragmatic consolidation of power. The unification of Germany did more than redraw the map of Europe. It shifted the balance of power, creating a new heavyweight in the continental ring. The German Empire, with its industrial might and military prowess, was a force to be reckoned with. Yet, the seeds of future conflict were sown in the very soil of Bismarck's successes. The humiliation of France and the new power dynamics would contribute to the tensions leading up to World War I. Bismarck's legacy is one of brilliance and brutality, a reminder that the path to greatness is often paved with calculated risks and moral compromises. He was the architect of a unified Germany, but also the pioneer of a political strategy that left a trail of mistrust and resentment across Europe. His story is a cautionary tale of ambition and the cost of power, a narrative as compelling today as it was in the corridors of 19th century Europe. As we close this chapter on Bismarck's foreign policy, one thing is clear. The Iron Chancellor's maneuvers were as sharp as the swords he once wielded in duels. His ability to manipulate alliances, provoke wars, and capitalize on opportunities was unmatched. Yet, his legacy is a double-edged sword, a testament to the complexities of leadership and the enduring impact of one man's vision. Stay tuned, because the story of Otto von Bismarck is far from over. The echoes of his actions will reverberate through history, shaping the destinies of nations and the course of empires. And as we look to the next chapter, we can only wonder, What lessons does the past still hold for us today? As the dust settled after the proclamation of the German Empire, Bismarck's political career seemed untouchable, like a fortress made of iron and wit. Yet, even the Iron Chancellor was not immune to the shifting sands of power politics. By the late 1880, the man who had orchestrated the unification of Germany found himself increasingly out of tune with the political symphony he'd once conducted. Enter Wilhelm Roman II, the new Kaiser with a penchant for grandeur and a mind of his own. When Wilhelm took the throne in 1888, it was like handing the keys of a finely tuned Mercedes over to someone who preferred flashy sports cars. Bismarck, accustomed to steering the ship of state with a steady hand, now faced a ruler eager to grab the wheel. The young Kaiser fancied himself a visionary, and Bismarck's pragmatic approach seemed as outdated as yesterday's newspaper to him. The cracks in their relationship widened quickly. Wilhelm Roman II was all about the splashy gestures and global ambitions, the kind that would make a peacock look modest. Bismarck, on the other hand, preferred the quiet machinations of diplomacy over the bluster of grandstanding. Their differences came to a head over the issue of social policy. Wilhelm wanted to woo the working class with reforms, but Bismarck, ever the conservative strategist, viewed such moves as pandering. The tipping point arrived with the anti-socialist laws. These laws, which Bismarck had championed since 1878 to suppress the growing socialist movement, were up for renewal. Wilhelm saw them as a hindrance to his plans for social reform, while Bismarck viewed them as essential to maintaining order. The clash was inevitable, and in March 1890, Bismarck found himself on the receiving end of a not-so-subtle nudge out the door. It was the end of an era. The Chancellor, who had dominated European politics for nearly 3 decades, was forced to resign. And so, Bismarck exited the stage not with a bang, but with a grumble. He retreated to his estate in Friedrichsruh, bitter about his dismissal and skeptical about the future of the empire he had built. The irony was palpable. A man who had once wielded power with such finesse now found himself a spectator to the unfolding drama. He spent his final years writing his memoirs, perhaps hoping to shape his legacy with the same precision he'd applied to statecraft. Reflecting on Bismarck's legacy is a bit like examining a Rorschach test. What you see depends on where you stand. On one hand, he was the architect of a unified Germany, a political maestro whose strategies altered the course of European history. His Realpolitik approach, where the ends justified the means, left an indelible mark on the art of diplomacy. Bismarck's alliances and treaties, like the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary and Italy, seemed to ensure a balance of power, keeping the continent relatively stable during his tenure. Yet, there's a darker shade to this picture. Bismarck's legacy is also one of division and discord. His manipulation of alliances and his penchant for secrecy fostered an atmosphere of mistrust among European powers. The very alliances that Bismarck had forged became brittle after his departure, as new leaders failed to maintain the delicate balance he had orchestrated. The result, a series of chain reactions that would lead to the horrors of World War I. Bismarck's carefully constructed house of cards collapsed under the weight of new ambitions and old grudges. His successors lacked his deft touch, and the alliances he had so meticulously crafted unraveled like a poorly knit sweater. The irony is rich. A man who spent his career trying to prevent continental-scale conflict inadvertently laid the groundwork for the deadliest war in history. In the end, Bismarck's legacy is a complex tapestry woven from threads of power, strategy, and unintended consequence. He was a genius of political maneuvering, yet his successes sowed the seeds of future discord. It's a classic tale of ambition meeting reality, where the grand designs of one era become the cautionary tales of the next. As we close the book on Bismarck's story, one can't help but ponder the lessons his life offers. Perhaps the most enduring insight is the reminder that even the most brilliant strategies are not immune to the passage of time and the unpredictability of human nature. Bismarck's political genius was unmatched, but it was also a double-edged sword, cutting both ways in the annals of history. The Iron Chancellor may have fallen from power, but his shadow looms large over the past century. His name endures as both a symbol of unity and a harbinger of division. Bismarck's story is a testament to the complexities of leadership and the enduring impact of one man's vision. As we look to the future, it's clear that the echoes of his actions still reverberate, shaping the destinies of nations and the course of empires. Now, as you drift off with new knowledge, remember, even the greatest plans can unravel, leaving behind a tangled web of triumph and tragedy. Isaac Newton entered the world on a day most people were busy unwrapping gifts or nursing hangovers from mulled wine. It was December 25, 1642, a day that, in retrospect, feels like it came with a new genius alert. Just as Galileo was exiting stage left, having died earlier that year, Newton was making his grand entrance in Lincolnshire, England. Talk about cosmic timing or a celestial handoff, right? But let's not pretend Newton's early life was a fairy tale. In fact, if you were to write a screenplay about his childhood, you'd file it squarely in the drama section. Born prematurely and so small he could fit in a quart mug, Newton's survival was a miracle of its own. His father had died 3 months before he was born, leaving his mother, Hannah, to raise a pint-sized prodigy all by herself. So, when Hannah decided to remarry and move away, leaving 3-year-old Isaac with his grandparents, you can imagine this didn't exactly set the stage for a healthy, well-adjusted upbringing. If he'd had access to a therapist, they'd have had a field day. Fast forward to Newton's teenage years, and you find him in Lincolnshire, more precisely, at the King's School in Grantham. The place was as thrilling as a wet weekend in the countryside, but it was here that Newton's interests began to take a decidedly non-agricultural turn. While other boys might have been dreaming of ploughing fields or raising livestock, Newton was busy building models of windmills and crafting sundials. Clearly, he had other plans that didn't involve getting his hands dirty with farming muck. Now, if you think his school years were all about straight A's and gold stars, think again. Newton wasn't exactly showered with accolades or Student of the Month awards. His teachers probably didn't peg him as a future knight of the realm or a mathematical colossus. But there was a glimmer of something in Newton that suggested his future lay beyond the cornfields and sheep pens of Lincolnshire. He had a knack for academics, which, let's be honest, was a godsend for a kid who was about as suited for farming as a cat is for synchronized swimming. Newton's time at the King's School was a pivot point, a fork in the road that led him away from the family farm and into the world of academia. It must have been a relief for his family, too, given that the thought of Isaac managing a farm was about as plausible as a cow winning a chess game. Grantham itself was a bustling market town, a place where Newton could lose himself in the chaos of commerce and ideas. It was here that he started to blossom intellectually, even if his social skills were still firmly rooted in the work-in-progress category. But let's not sugarcoat it. Newton's childhood wasn't all sundials and windmills. The reality of his early life was far from idyllic, marred by familial abandonment and a sense of alienation. Yet these struggles perhaps fed the fires of his later genius. After all, adversity has a funny way of either breaking a person or forging them into something extraordinary. In Newton's case, it was very much the latter. He was not destined to be a footnote in history, but rather the headline act in the scientific revolution that followed. By the time Newton left for Cambridge University in 1661, he was already nurturing a mind that would soon defy the gravitational pull of obscurity. He had survived a childhood that could have easily sapped him of his potential. Instead, he turned those early challenges into the building blocks of his genius. So, next time you're sipping on eggnog during the holidays, spare a thought for the tiny boy born on a frosty Christmas morning who would grow up to redefine our understanding of the universe. So, off to Cambridge University went young Isaac, clutching his scholarship like a golden ticket to the world of academia. It was 1661, and this wasn't just any university. It was the intellectual epicenter where the likes of Francis Bacon had once roamed the halls. The campus was less about toga parties and more about toga-like robes, a place where ideas were the currency and Newton was ready to cash in. Cambridge in the 17th century was a bit like an intellectual buffet for Newton. Picture this: a young man stepping into a library filled with the works of Descartes, Galileo, and Kepler, his eyes wide as saucers. Descartes in particular was a revelation. In a world where most people were still trying to figure out how to navigate a map, Descartes was busy saying things like, I think, therefore I am. For Newton, this was not just philosophy. It was an invitation to think differently, to question everything from the ground up. Now, don't get the wrong idea. Newton wasn't the life of the party at Cambridge. In fact, his social calendar could have fit on a post-it note. While his peers might have been off indulging in whatever passed for fun in the 1660, Newton was more likely to be found scribbling away in his notebooks, pondering the mysteries of the universe. He was the guy who, instead of painting the town red, was busy figuring out why the apple fell to the ground and not sideways or upwards. And then, just as Newton was getting into the swing of things, the universe decided to throw a curveball. Enter the Great Plague of 1665, which turned out to be a not-so-subtle nudge for the university to close its doors. Social distancing, 17th century style, meant Cambridge sent everyone packing. For Newton, it was back to Lincolnshire, to his family's estate at Woolsthorpe Manor. Now, what was supposed to be a hiatus from academia became the most productive vacation in history. Remember, this is a man who didn't need a laboratory to tinker with the cosmos. Armed with only his thoughts and a few rudimentary tools, Newton began to reshape the very foundations of science. Calculus, that mathematical magic trick that makes high school students weep, took shape during this period. In a span of 2 years, Newton essentially wrote the manual on everything from motion to optics. Because when life gives you a plague, you invent calculus, apparently. Let's pause for a reality check. The romanticized image of Newton sitting under an apple tree, being bonked on the head and suddenly understanding gravity, is a delightful tale, but it's just that, a tale. The truth is far less whimsical and much more impressive. Newton spent countless hours calculating, theorizing, and scribbling notes that would eventually form his laws of motion. It wasn't a eureka moment. It was a relentless pursuit of understanding, a testament to sheer intellectual grit. The optics experiments, too, were far from child's play. Newton was busy splitting light with prisms, discovering that white light was, in fact, a spectrum of colors. Imagine him in a dark room, beams of light splitting and dancing around him as he scribbled down his observations. It's enough to make you appreciate the next rainbow you see, knowing that Newton saw it first in a beam of refracted light. So, while the world was reeling from the plague, Newton was quietly, yet profoundly, rewriting the rules of science. His time away from Cambridge was a masterclass in turning adversity into opportunity. This was a period that showed the world that brilliance doesn't need a formal setting. Sometimes, it just needs a bit of solitude and a mind unafraid to wander. And when Newton finally returned to Cambridge in 1667, he wasn't just another student. He was a force of nature, ready to unleash his discoveries on the unsuspecting academic world. The seeds of his genius, planted during those solitary years, would soon grow into a revolution that would change the world forever. But for now, let's leave young Isaac on the cusp of greatness, poised to step into the next chapter of his life, where the world would come knocking, eager to learn what this reclusive scholar had discovered in his time away from the ivory towers of Cambridge. As Newton strolled back into Cambridge, the air must have felt thick with possibility, or maybe it was just the thick academic robes weighing him down. He returned not as a student, but as a sage with secrets of the universe tucked into his notebooks. The plague years had been his chrysalis, and now he was ready to spread his intellectual wings. But before we dive into the avalanche of discoveries he unleashed, let's take a sidestep to talk about that apple. You know, the one that supposedly conked him on the head and led to the theory of gravity. It's a charming story, right? A kind of eureka moment that makes for great retellings in school assemblies. But like many legendary tales, it's about as factual as a unicorn siding at Trafalgar Square. The truth is a bit more mundane, but no less awe-inspiring. Yes, an apple did fall, but it was more a metaphorical light bulb moment than a physical bonk on the noggin. It happened around 1666, during those plague-induced sabbaticals back home. Newton observed apples falling straight down, pondering why they didn't drift sideways or float upward like some cosmic balloon. This simple observation led him to consider that perhaps the same force pulling the apple was what kept the moon in orbit around Earth. Rather than a single epiphany, it was the culmination of relentless curiosity and a knack for questioning the status quo. Newton didn't just have a eureka moment. He had a, let me think about this for a decade moment. Fast forward to 1687, and Newton had finally distilled his musings into the magnum opus that would revolutionize science. The Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or just Principia, for those of us who prefer our Latin in small doses. This was no light bedtime reading. Principia was a dense, 3-volume work that laid the foundation for classical mechanics. It introduced the 3 laws of motion, which, let's face it, are as ubiquitous today as Wi-Fi. First, the law of inertia. Objects at rest stay at rest, and objects in motion stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Second, the law of acceleration. Force equals mass times acceleration, a simple equation that underpins everything from launching rockets to calculating car crashes. And third, the law of action and reaction. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, which explains why you don't fall through the floor every time you take a step. Then there was universal gravitation, the bombshell that clarified why planets orbit stars, and why you, dear listener, are not floating away into the void. Newton's gravitational theory was nothing short of a cosmic mic drop moment. It mathematically explained the elliptical orbits of planets, building on Kepler's observations and Descartes' philosophy. Newton had, in essence, formulated a universal law that applied equally to apples and asteroids. And he did all of this with a quill and a candle, not a supercomputer or even a decent cup of coffee. But before you crown him the undisputed king of science, let's talk about the human side of Newton's genius. For all his intellectual prowess, Newton was as embroiled in human drama as any reality TV star. One of his most notable adversaries was Robert Hooke, a key figure in the Royal Society, and a man whose ego was almost as large as his scientific contributions. Hooke had his own theories on light and gravity, and when Newton's ideas began gaining traction, Hooke wasn't exactly sending congratulatory fruit baskets. The tension between the two was palpable, like 2 heavyweight intellectuals squaring off in a boxing ring of ideas. Their rivalry reached its peak with the publication of Principia. Hooke claimed that Newton had borrowed from his work on gravitational theory. Newton, in response, did what any respectable scholar would do. He cut Hooke down to size with biding correspondence, and rumor has it, refused to include Hooke's name in the final publication of Principia. The scientific community was a hotbed of competition, not unlike today's tech startups battling for supremacy. Newton's disputes with Hooke were emblematic of the era's academic rivalries, where ideas were currency and reputations were fiercely guarded. Newton's dealings with the Royal Society, the hub of scientific discourse, were equally fraught. The Society was a platform for innovation, but also a political minefield. Funding was scarce, and the politics were as treacherous as the London fog. Newton had allies, like Edmund Halley, who was instrumental in pushing Principia to publication, but he also had detractors who found his prickly personality and domineering intellect hard to swallow. Despite these challenges, Newton's work was supported by the Society, albeit not without a few metaphorical bruises along the way. Financially, Newton wasn't exactly rolling in gold coins. The publication of Principia was a costly endeavor, and funds were often cobbled together with the help of benefactors like Halley, who dipped into his own pockets to ensure the book saw the light of day. It was a testament to the belief in Newton's theories, an investment in the future of science. So there you have it, a heady mix of intellectual triumphs and human follies. Newton's journey through the scientific landscape of the 17th century was fraught with challenges, both financial and political. Yet, his work laid the groundwork for a scientific revolution, a seismic shift in understanding that would echo through the centuries. The Principia was not just a book. It was a cornerstone that would underpin the edifice of modern science. As we leave Newton at this pivotal chapter, remember that his genius was not just in the ideas he conjured, but in the relentless pursuit of truth in a world filled with doubt and dispute. The story of Isaac Newton is far from over, and as we move forward, the complexities of his later life will continue to unfold, revealing even more layers of this extraordinary figure. As we've left Newton basking in the glow of his intellectual triumphs, let's pivot to a chapter of his life where he traded in his academic robes for something a bit more governmental. By the time the late 1690s rolled around, Newton was far from done revolutionizing the world. But instead of dabbling in the stars and celestial mechanics, he turned his attention to something decidedly more terrestrial: money. And not just any money. The British currency, which, at the time, was as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Enter 1696, and Newton found himself appointed warden of the Royal Mint, a position that might sound as exciting as watching paint dry, but was actually a hotbed of intrigue and economic chaos. The British economy was a mess. Counterfeiting was rampant, and the currency was about as trustworthy as a dodgy used car salesman. Counterfeiters were having a field day, and the coinage was so debased it was barely worth the metal it was minted on. Talk about a fiscal nightmare. So, what does our dear Newton do? He rolls up his sleeves and dives headfirst into this economic quagmire. His analytical mind, which had once decoded the heavens, now turned its focus to sorting out the clinking chaos of coins. And here's the kicker. Newton wasn't just some figurehead in a fancy wig. He was hands-on, employing his scientific rigor to weigh coins, assess their metal content, and even personally oversee trials of the picks, a ceremonial but crucial testing of coins' quality. The man was meticulous to the point of obsession, which, as it turns out, was exactly what the mint needed. One of his boldest moves was to call for the great recoinage of 1696. It was a sweeping reform that sought to replace old, clipped coins with freshly minted, full-weight currency. Sounds simple, right? But the logistics were a nightmare. Imagine trying to overhaul an entire nation's currency system with the tools of the 17th century. No computers, no digital transactions, just hammers, anvils, and a lot of elbow grease. The cost was astronomical, running into hundreds of thousands of pounds, a sum that could make even the hardiest economist break into a cold sweat. But Newton wasn't just a number cruncher. He was a detective. He took it upon himself to hunt down counterfeiters, and he was relentless. One of his most famous adversaries was William Challoner, a cunning forger who was as slippery as an eel in a barrel of oil. Challoner had a knack for evading capture, but Newton, with the tenacity of a bulldog, gathered evidence, conducted interrogations, and built a case that ultimately led to Challoner's conviction and execution. It was a testament to Newton's determination to uphold justice and stabilize the economy, even if it meant getting his hands metaphorically dirty. Now, while Newton was busy chasing counterfeiters and reforming currency, he didn't entirely abandon his other intellectual pursuits. One of his lesser-known passions was alchemy, which, in modern terms, is about as scientifically rigorous as reading tea leaves. Yet, in Newton's time, alchemy was a serious business. It was the precursor to chemistry, and many of its practitioners genuinely believed in the possibility of transmuting base metals into gold. Newton's private notebooks are filled with references to alchemical texts and experiments, suggesting he spent considerable time pondering the mysteries of the philosopher's stone. But let's not mark his alchemical pursuits too harshly. Sure, they might not have been the pinnacle of scientific inquiry, but they reflect Newton's insatiable curiosity and his willingness to explore the unknown. Alchemy, with its mystical allure, offered a different kind of intellectual challenge, a puzzle wrapped in esoteric language and symbolism. It was less about turning lead into gold and more about understanding the fundamental nature of matter. And if nothing else, it highlights the multifaceted nature of Newton's genius. He was a man unafraid to venture into uncharted intellectual territories, even if they occasionally led him down rabbit holes. Then there's Newton's theological musings, another aspect of his life that's often overshadowed by his scientific achievements. He was deeply religious, but his beliefs were unconventional. Newton spent years studying biblical texts, seeking to reconcile his scientific understanding of the universe with his faith. He wrote extensively on matters of theology, producing works that questioned traditional interpretations of the Bible and proposed his own esoteric readings. In a time when religious dissent could land you in hot water, Newton's theological writings were kept largely private, revealing a side of him that was introspective and in some ways deeply conflicted. And yet, all these pursuits, whether economic, alchemical, or theological, showcase a man whose intellect knew no bounds. Newton's later years were less about resting on his laurels and more about expanding his horizons, even if it meant venturing into areas that today seem outlandish or obsolete. His role at the Mint, his alchemical experiments, and his theological writings all reflect his relentless pursuit of knowledge. a quest that defied the conventional wisdom of his time. So, as we leave Newton in the midst of his economic overhaul, a man juggling coins, counterfeiters, and cosmic curiosities, remember that his genius wasn't confined to a single domain. It was a relentless drive to understand the world in all its complexity, a pursuit that took him from the heights of scientific discovery to the depths of economic reform, and beyond. As we turn the page to the final chapter of Newton's life, let's keep in mind that his legacy is as much about the questions he asked as the answers he found. The story of Isaac Newton is far from over, and his final years will reveal yet more facets of this extraordinary figure. Now, let's segue from Newton's multifaceted pursuits into his crowning achievements, those public accolades that cemented his status as a titan of science. By 1703, Newton had climbed to the top of the academic heap and snagged the presidency of the Royal Society. Think of it as the ultimate nerd prom, where the best and brightest of the scientific world gathered to share ideas, argue over theories, and occasionally throw shade at their rivals. This wasn't just a ceremonial role where he could sit back and sip tea. Newton wielded real influence, helping steer the course of scientific inquiry and cementing the society as a cornerstone of intellectual progress. Newton's presidency marked a shift from the contentious rivalries of the past. Remember Robert Hooke? Well, by this time, Hooke was gone, having passed away in 1703, the same year Newton took the helm. Some might say Newton's ascendancy was a bit of poetic justice, given their previous clashes. But let's not dwell on that too much. Under Newton's leadership, the society flourished, attracting luminaries like Edmund Halley and Christopher Wren, and fostering a collaborative atmosphere that was less about cutthroat competition and more about collective advancement. It was during Newton's tenure that the society published some of its most groundbreaking works, further spreading his influence across Europe and beyond. Then came 1705, a year when Newton's contributions were formally recognized with a knighthood. Yes, Sir Isaac Newton. Sounds pretty grand, doesn't it? Queen Anne herself bestowed this honor, a rare accolade for a scientist in an era when knighthoods were typically reserved for military heroes and political bigwigs. This was not just a nod to his scientific achievements, but also to his role in reforming the British economy. Newton was now a bona fide celebrity, the kind of intellectual giant who could stroll through the halls of power as easily as he navigated the complexities of calculus. But let's not get carried away with the pageantry of titles and honors. Newton, for all his accolades, was still a complex and often contradictory character. The myth of Newton as the solitary genius, toiling away in an ivory tower, is only half the story. The reality is that Newton was part of a vibrant scientific community, network of thinkers who challenged and supported one another. His work was not created in a vacuum, but was a product of its time, an era of exploration, discovery, and intellectual upheaval. As Newton settled into his later years, he continued to grapple with the big questions, delving into theology and biblical chronology with the same rigor he applied to physics. He even attempted to predict the apocalypse, suggesting the world might end in 2060. Spoiler alert, we're still here, so maybe take that prediction with a grain of salt. But his foray into these esoteric realms shows a man still searching for answers, unafraid to venture into territories that might seem outlandish to modern sensibilities. Newton's health, however, began to decline as the years wore on. By the 1720s, he was living in London, where he spent his final years overseeing the Royal Mint and continuing his work with the Royal Society. In March 1727, Newton passed away at the ripe old age of 84, a remarkable lifespan for the time, considering the average life expectancy was barely half that. His funeral was a grand affair, attended by luminaries from across the scientific and political spectrum. Newton was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, a fitting tribute to a man whose ideas had reshaped the world. So, what do we make of Newton's legacy? Well, let's start with the obvious. His contributions to mathematics and physics are monumental. His laws of motion and universal gravitation laid the groundwork for modern science, providing the tools that would eventually lead to everything from space exploration to smartphone technology. Without Newton, might still be wandering around in the intellectual dark ages. fumbling with ideas like a caveman trying to figure out fire. Yet, Newton's legacy extends beyond his scientific achievements. He was a pioneer in the true sense of the word, unafraid to challenge established norms and push the boundaries of human understanding. His willingness to question everything, from the movement of the planets to the nature of light, set a precedent for future generations of scientists. He showed us that the world is not a static entity to be accepted at face value, but a complex, dynamic system to be explored and understood. And let's not forget the human side of Newton, a man who, despite his genius, was not immune to the foibles and follies of humanity. His rivalries, his obsessions, even his ventures into alchemy and theology all paint a picture of a deeply curious soul, driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge. Newton was a man of contradictions, a scientist who dabbled in mysticism, a recluse who shaped public discourse, a revolutionary thinker who was also a bureaucrat. It's these complexities that make him not just a historical figure, but a compelling character in the grand narrative of human progress. Today, Newton's influence is as pervasive as ever. His ideas continue to shape the landscape of science and technology, inspiring new generations of thinkers and innovators. From the classroom to the cosmos, Newton's legacy is a testament to the power of human curiosity and the relentless pursuit of truth. So, the next time you glance at an apple, a prism, or even a coin, remember that you're seeing the world through Newton's eyes, a world where the mysteries of the universe are just waiting to be unraveled. Your eyelids are like medieval drawbridges refusing to rise, but it's time to face the day. The rooster hasn't even thought about waking up yet, but you're already shivering in the pitch-black cold. Welcome to a medieval bakery shift, where your day starts so early, even the stars are yawning. Forget snooze buttons. You've got dough to manage. You slip out from under your scratchy wool blanket, which, by the way, hasn't seen a wash in weeks. Personal hygiene in the Middle Ages. Let's just say standards were a bit, different. But no time to ponder that. You're heading to the bakery where the real action is as relentless as it is exhausting. Now, why on earth are you up so early? Well, let's talk bread, the medieval MVP of the food world. In an era where your choice of carbs was basically bread or more bread, bakers were the unsung heroes, often cranking out thousands of loaves a day. Bread wasn't just a side dish, it was the meal. And you, dear medieval baker, are about to learn why this staple needed such dedication. Your first task involves the grind, literally. Flour production back then wasn't a gentle tap on a touchscreen, but an intense full-body workout. You and the millstone, round and round. It's like CrossFit, but without the Instagram selfies. Wheat is ground into flour, and if you're lucky, you've got a watermill to help. But often, it's just you, sweat, and muscle. Around 500 revolutions to produce a single pound of flour. That's right, you're burning calories just to get calories. Who needs a gym membership, right? But let's talk economics. Bread wasn't just a dietary staple, it was a financial cornerstone. Prices were regulated by the assize of bread and ale, a medieval attempt at market control. It determined how much bread should cost based on the price of wheat. A loaf could cost a farthing, which in modern terms is a tiny fraction of a penny. But trust me, for a medieval peasant living on the edge, this was serious dough. Pun intended. Here's another twist. The quality of your bread depended on your social status. The well-off chewed on fine white bread known as manchet, while the common folk gnawed on coarse cheat, or maslin, made from a mix of wheat and rye. If you were really down on your luck, you'd be stuck with horse bread, a charming concoction mixed with peas and beans. Basically, the medieval version of a kitchen sink smoothie. But let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval bread could be dangerous. No, not the gluten. That's a modern anxiety. I'm talking ergot, a fungus that could infect rye and lead to ergotism. Symptoms ranged from hallucinations to gangrene. Yes, your breakfast could literally drive you mad or cost you a limb. Delicious. As you toil, you realize the bakery is a microcosm of medieval life. Endless labor, unpredictable outcomes, and a pinch of danger. Bakers were often fined for selling underweight loaves or mixing in unsavory fillers. You had to be clever and cautious, balancing between profit and punishment. It's a tough gig, and you're barely halfway through the day. The morning drags on, and you're already covered in a fine layer of flour. It's like a medieval spa treatment, but instead of rejuvenation, you're just itchy and pale. The air is thick with the smell of yeast and smoke. The oven is a monstrosity, a cavernous beast that could fit a few dozen loaves at a time. You stoke it with wood, mindful of the heat, but also the cost. Wood doesn't come cheap, and efficiency is key. As you continue, you're not just making bread, you're part of a vital economic cycle. Bread fed armies, sustained workers, and defined social hierarchies. The ability to bake wasn't just a skill, it was power. And with power came responsibility and risk. In the quiet moments you might romanticize this life. The simplicity, the craft, the community. But don't be fooled. This is a tough, relentless world where every task is manual and every outcome uncertain. The romantic image of a medieval baker, peacefully kneading dough by the hearth, is a myth. In reality, it's a grind, painful, risky, and essential. So as you knead and sweat, remember, you're not just making bread. You're part of a bigger story. A story of survival, innovation, and sometimes sheer luck. And you're only halfway through your day. The rooster might crow soon, but for you, it's just another reminder that in this medieval world, the grind never stops. And just when you think you've got this whole medieval bakery gig figured out, the sun starts casting long shadows across your flour-dusted workspace. That's right. Your kneading dough like your life depends on it because, in many ways, it does. The dough isn't just a mix of flour and water. It's a testament to your patience, skill, and let's be real, your ability to function on minimal sleep. Kneading. This isn't some gentle activity reserved for Instagram bakers showcasing their artisanal loaves. No, this is a full-body workout that would put any modern-day kickboxing class to shame. Kneading dough in the Middle Ages requires technique. Think of it as a medieval martial art. You push, fold, and stretch the dough, working out the gluten, which, unbeknownst to medieval folks, is the protein giving bread its structure. You're not just making food, you're crafting the medieval equivalent of a smartphone, indispensable and always in demand. Now, let's peel back the layers of this doughy enterprise and dive into the labyrinthine world of guilds. Picture this. Guilds were the medieval version of labor unions, trade schools, and regulatory bodies all rolled into one. They dictated every rise and fall of your bread, setting standards for quality and price, and ensuring that no rogue baker could spoil the whole batch. You think your boss is tough? Try answering to a guild master who could fine you into oblivion or worse, publicly shame you for selling subpar bread. Guilds were serious business. They controlled everything from the number of apprentices you could have to the exact weight and quality of your bread. And trust me, they weren't about to let you sneak a few extra ounces of sawdust into your dough to stretch that flour supply. No, sir, medieval quality control meant that your loaves were inspected, and if they didn't measure up, you'd face fines that could cost you more than a week's worth of profits. And if you were caught selling underweight loaves, you could find yourself strapped to the pillory, a delightful contraption designed for public humiliation. Bread wasn't just a livelihood, it was a high-stakes game. The guild hierarchy was as complex as the dough itself. At the top, you had the guild masters, seasoned bakers who descended the flowery ladder and held the keys to the kingdom. Below them were journeymen, skilled bakers who completed their apprenticeships but hadn't yet achieved mastery. And at the bottom, apprentices, the eager young souls learning the craft, often treated like human pack mules. These roles weren't just job titles. They were social positions that dictated your place in the broader tapestry of medieval life. But wait, there's more. The guilds didn't just regulate, they celebrated. Feast days, which were basically medieval block parties, were organized to honor patron saints or commemorate significant events. These were the rare occasions when bakers could step away from their ovens and enjoy a slice of life, literally. Imagine the camaraderie, the sense of community, as you shared stories over a communal table, the air thick with the smell of roasted meats and the sounds of lute music. It's like a medieval office party, but with more mead and less awkward small talk about weekend plans. Yet, beneath these festivities lay the ever-looming threat of economic instability. The price of wheat could fluctuate wildly due to factors like bad harvests or war, leaving the guilds scrambling to maintain those meticulously set bread prices. This delicate balance between supply and demand was as precarious as a mill fuel. One wrong move and the whole structure could crumble. And if the guild failed to maintain the price of bread, it wasn't just bakers who suffered. Entire communities felt the pinch. Bread riots weren't just figments of revolutionary France. They happened across medieval Europe whenever the balance tipped too far. The guilds also wielded considerable political clout. They influenced local governments, ensuring that bakers had a voice in decisions that affected their trade. This wasn't some medieval version of casual lobbying. Guilds could make or break local economies, and their leaders often held positions of power within city councils. It's not just about who kneads the dough, but who holds the strings. As you continue to knead, you ponder this intricate web of rules and relationships. The romantic notion of being a simple baker in a picturesque village is just that, a notion. In reality, every loaf is a testament to your ability to navigate a world where one misstep could lead to ruin. You're not just a baker, you're a craftsman, an economist, and at times a diplomat. The sun climbs higher, casting its golden rays through the windows, illuminating your flour-dusted world. It's a reminder that while the day might be long, it's far from over. You've got orders to fill, guild rules to follow, and a reputation to maintain. In this medieval bakery, the work is relentless, the stakes are high, and every loaf tells a story. As the day heats up, you brace yourself for the afternoon rush. The bread must be ready for the market, each loaf inspected for quality, weight, and taste. It's a delicate dance, balancing speed and precision, all while keeping an eye on the ever-watchful guild masters. Your hands, though weary, continue their rhythmic dance, shaping dough into the sustenance that fuels medieval life. And while you're just one baker in a vast and complex world, you've got a role to play, a role that, despite its challenges, keeps the wheels of history ever turning. As the sun's rays stretch across your flour-dusted domain, the bakery transforms from a quiet workshop into a bustling marketplace of human drama and doughy transactions. This isn't your grandma's bake sale. It's more like a medieval theater where you're both the star and the stagehand. By mid-morning, you're not just managing dough, you're juggling an eclectic cast of characters, all with their own appetites and attitudes, because hey, who knew bread could be such a social catalyst? First up, the peasants. These folks are as regular as clockwork, except this clock is wound by the necessity of survival. They shuffle in, clutching their meager coins, or more likely, something to barter. Because let's face it, medieval pockets were more often filled with IOUs than actual currency. Think eggs, a jug of milk, or even a shaky promise of future labor. It's a barter bazaar where a loaf of bread might just cost you a day's worth of farm chores. Kind of like trading your electric toothbrush for a cup of artisanal coffee, except with more manure and fewer Instagram posts. But don't mistake simplicity for insignificance. These peasants are your bread and butter, pun intended. They keep the wheels of the bakery spinning, and their presence is a reminder that even in a world where survival could be as fickle as a medieval monarch, people still needed bread to break. Yet their visit isn't just a transaction. It's a lifeline, a daily affirmation that in this unforgiving world, there's still a place for community, even if it's over a loaf of coarse rye. Then we have the merchants and craftsmen, your middle-class clientele. They stride in with a bit more swagger, perhaps clutching a few extra farthings or a particularly shiny trinket. These are the folks who might actually pay in hard currency, lending an air of sophistication to the rustic setting. But don't let that fool you. They're as haggling prone as the rest. The price of bread is like a medieval stock ticker, constantly in flux, and they are here to negotiate their way to a bargain. It's a high-stakes game where the currency might be real, but the stakes are bread, literally and figuratively. Now, let's talk about the nobles. Yes, they do grace your humble shop with their presence from time to time. Picture them sweeping in with retinues and attitudes, their servants doing the actual buying while they glance around, perhaps considering whether manchet bread is up to their gilded standards. These aristocrats are here for the finest white bread, the medieval equivalent of a luxury brand, and they expect nothing less than perfection. They're not here to chit-chat or barter. They're here to remind you of your place on the social ladder. And just like that, the bakery becomes a microcosm of medieval society, where everyone knows their place, and bread is both a staple and a symbol. But wait, there's a twist in this medieval sitcom. While bakers like you were indispensable to the community, they were also regarded with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Why? Because bread prices were a political hot potato, volatile and prone to causing unrest. The assize of bread and ale might have set the prices, but that didn't stop folks from grumbling when their wallets felt the pinch. Bread riots were a thing, and they weren't just sparked by shortages or poor quality. Sometimes they were the result of perceived injustices, a community's way of saying, we're mad as heck, and were not going to take it anymore. For bakers, this meant you were always walking a fine line. Your livelihood depended not just on your skills, but also on your ability to read the room, or rather, the community. Charge too much, and you risked being the target of public ire. Charge too little, and you might not afford the next batch of flour. It's a delicate dance, and one misstep could lead to financial ruin or worse. A visit from the local authorities, who took a keen interest in keeping the peace, often at the expense of individual livelihoods. So there you are, not just a baker but a community diplomat, balancing the needs of your customers with the ever-watchful eye of the law. It's a complicated relationship, full of unspoken agreements and mutual dependencies. You need them as much as they need you, and in this tightly woven social fabric, one thread pulled too hard could unravel the whole tapestry. Yet, despite the challenges, there's an undeniable satisfaction in knowing that your bread is more than just sustenance. It's a connection, a shared experience that binds the community together, one loaf at a time. It's the taste of home for the weary traveler, the promise of a meal for the hungry laborer, and even a status symbol for the discerning noble. In a world where life was often brutish and short, a simple loaf of bread could bridge divides, spark conversations, and even ignite revolutions. As the morning wears on, you find yourself in a rhythm, a seamless choreography of kneading, baking, and selling. The heat from the oven feels like both a burden and a blessing, its warmth a constant reminder of the fire you carry, not just within the bakery, but within the community. You're not just making bread, you're making history, one loaf at a time. And as you serve your eclectic clientele, you know that despite the hardships, there's a certain magic in this ancient craft. It's a magic born of necessity, skill, and above all, the simple human need to break bread together. And just as you settle into the rhythm of your bustling bakery, the midday sun decides to show up like an unwelcome house guest, turning your already toasty workspace into a medieval sauna. Picture this. The air thickens with humidity, and your once flowery brow now resembles a wash basin as sweat trickles down in rivulets. You might think of artisan baking as a quaint, peaceful endeavor, but here's the truth bomb. It's less about zen and more about surviving your daily bread marathon without passing out. Welcome to the real medieval bakery experience, where the romance of bread making meets the grueling reality of labor. Forget the Instagrammable shots of rustic loaves cooling on a windowsill. This is about enduring the suffocating heat, soot-stained walls, and the unforgiving pace that makes the Tour de France look like a leisurely bike ride. And speaking of speed, let's talk technology, medieval style. While the word technology might conjure images of sleek gadgets and digital wizardry, back in the day, it was all about practical innovations. Take the humble windmill, for instance. Sure, water mills were the powerhouses of flour production, but in regions where water was as rare as a dragon sighting, windmills stepped in to fill the void. These towering structures harnessed the breeze to grind grains, a medieval turbo boost that saved you from a lifetime of sore muscles and back-breaking grindstone labor. But innovation didn't stop at windmills. Think about the ovens, those mighty beasts of baking. As rudimentary as they might seem, they were marvels of engineering for their time. The typical medieval oven was a massive, domed structure made of stone or brick, designed to retain heat long after the fire had died down. This meant you could bake multiple batches of bread with one firing, maximizing efficiency in a world where fuel was precious and time even more so. Of course, these innovations weren't just about making life easier. They were about staying competitive. Because let's face it, medieval bakers weren't exactly playing nice in the sandbox. No, this was more cutthroat than a Game of Thrones power struggle, with bakers vying for dominance in a market where reputation was everything. You see, in a world where bread was the main staple, being the go-to baker could mean the difference between prosperity and penury. Competition was fierce, and bakeries were known to employ some crafty tricks to get ahead. Ever heard of baker's dozen? While it's often romanticized as a generous gesture, it was actually a strategic move to avoid the hefty fines imposed for selling underweight loaves. By giving away an extra loaf, 13 instead of 12, you hedged your bets against the scales tipping unfavorably. It was less about benevolence and more about self-preservation, a clever tactic in a world where the law was as unforgiving as the summer sun beating down on your bakery. And let's not forget the sneaky shortcuts some bakers took, skirting the edges of legality with fillers like chalk or ground beans mixed into the dough. While it sounds like a medieval health hazard, and it was, such practices were a desperate bid to stretch limited resources. Picture your bread as a medieval smoothie, the kind where you're not entirely sure what's in it, but you hope it won't kill you. This shadowy side of baking wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving in a community that was both your customer base and your harshest critic. Reputation was currency, and a whisper of scandal could spread faster than a medieval plague, spelling doom for any baker caught in its wake. You had to be not just a master of dough, but a maestro of public relations, managing both your product and your patrons with equal skill. Meanwhile, as you wipe the sweat from your brow and prepare for the afternoon rush, you're reminded that this isn't just a job, it's a vocation. Each loaf is a labor of love and necessity, a crucial cog in the medieval economy. And while the myths of serene, pastoral baking might lure modern romantics, the reality was a relentless grind fraught with challenges. It's a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance, a narrative that's as much about survival as it is about sustenance. In this world, bread is more than just food. It's a symbol of resilience, a daily reminder that even in the most trying circumstances, we find ways to nourish not just our bodies, but our communities. As the afternoon heat rages on, you find a rhythm in the chaos, a steady cadence that carries you through the day. The sun may be merciless, and the work may be unyielding, but you know that every loaf tells a story of grit, determination, and the enduring human spirit. You're not just a baker, you're a custodian of tradition, a vital link in the chain of history that stretches back through the ages. And as you continue to knead, bake, and barter, you realize that in this ancient craft, there is a timeless truth. The more things change, the more they stay the same. From the bustling marketplace to the competitive guilds, from the innovations that shaped your day to the community that sustains you, the world of medieval baking is a testament to our enduring quest for connection and creativity. So, as the day draws to a close, and the shadows lengthen across your flower-streaked domain, you take a moment to appreciate the legacy you're part of. It's a legacy built on hard work, ingenuity, and the simple act of breaking bread together. A legacy that continues to shape the world, one loaf at a time. As the day draws to a close, and the shadows lengthen across your flower-streaked domain, you take a moment to appreciate the legacy you're part of. It's a legacy built on hard work, ingenuity, and the simple act of breaking bread together. A legacy that continues to shape the world, one loaf at a time. And just like that, you finally hang up your apron, feeling like you've sprinted through a marathon with dough as your only companion. You might think the job of a medieval baker was just about hustling bread, but let me tell you, it was so much more. It was akin to being a linchpin in a society where bread was not just food, but a symbol of life itself. Now, let's dig into why these medieval bakers deserve a standing ovation and a lifetime supply of whatever the medieval equivalent of coffee might have been. You see, bakers weren't just turning out loaves. They were crafting culture in their flour-dusted enclaves. Their work was a cornerstone of medieval life, making them more crucial than a knight in shining armor. Okay, maybe not as flashy, but definitely more essential. After all, you can't eat a sword, can you? The role of a baker was a balancing act on a tightrope strung between necessity and artistry. Bread was the staple of the medieval diet, consuming up to 70–80% of a peasant's calorie intake. There's your daily dose of carbs right there, no keto diet in sight. And when bread is basically the lifeblood of a society, the folks who make it are wielding more power than you might think. They weren't just feeding the hungry masses. They were maintaining the social order, keeping the peace, ensuring that every belly was filled enough to stave off revolt. This wasn't just a job, it was a public service. Yet beyond the loaves and the ovens, bakers were also the unsung architects of community cohesion. Their shops were the medieval equivalent of the local pub or the modern-day coffee shop, a place where people gathered, gossiped, and grumbled about the latest tax hike or the weather's refusal to cooperate. Each loaf they baked was a thread in the intricate tapestry of communal life, binding neighbors in a shared experience of daily sustenance. It was a tough gig, sure, but one that came with its own rewards, however intangible they might have been. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the past. It's time to debunk a few myths about the so-called rustic simplicity of medieval baking. Spoiler alert, it was anything but simple. The romantic notion of a peaceful, pastoral life, with idyllic mornings spent baking under the gentle sun, is a fairy tale. The reality, more like a never-ending endurance test set against a backdrop of economic instability and social pressure. Bakers were constantly juggling the fluctuating price of wheat, the exacting standards of guilds, and the ever-present threat of fines or worse. It was a grind, both figuratively and literally. And yet, despite these challenges, the legacy of medieval bakers continues to rise in our collective imagination, much like their well-leavened bread. Why? Perhaps because they embody a timeless truth about human resilience and ingenuity, the ability to create something vital from the simplest of ingredients. A bit of flour, water, and yeast speaks to a universal human drive to innovate, to survive, and to thrive against the odds. It's a narrative that resonates across centuries, a reminder that even in the most challenging times, we find ways to nourish not just our bodies, but our communities. As you reflect on the day, you realize that the rhythm of the bakery, its relentless pace, and its moments of quiet camaraderie, mirrors the larger currents of history. The bakers of the Middle Ages were more than mere craftsmen. They were custodians of a tradition that has endured through the ages, a tradition that continues to shape how we connect with each other and with our past. Each loaf they baked was a testament to their skill, their perseverance, and their place in the grand tapestry of human history. So, the next time you bite into a crusty baguette or a warm slice of sourdough, take a moment to appreciate the legacy of those medieval bakers. They may not have had the luxury of modern conveniences, but their resilience and ingenuity laid the foundation for a craft that continues to enrich our lives today. In a world that often feels as chaotic as a medieval marketplace, there's something profoundly comforting in knowing that the simple act of breaking bread remains a timeless ritual, a symbol of community, connection, and continuity. And with that, you step away from the oven, your heart as warm as the loaves you've spent the day crafting. You've not just survived another day in the life of a medieval baker, you've thrived, contributing to a tradition that has stood the test of time. As you close up shop, you carry with you a deeper understanding of the vital role these bakers played in shaping society, one loaf at a time. It's a legacy worth savoring, much like the bread itself, a legacy that continues to inspire and sustain us, even in our modern world.